All right, folks, it's that time again. Welcome back. So good to see you all on this lovely, lovely Wednesday evening. I'm just kidding, I'm done. I'm done. I was just messing with you. It is last day of learning, folks. Lots of fun-filled things to wrap up the day. Some review thereafter. You get a day of studying, and then Friday evening, instead of taking shots, we're all going to be hanging out, taking a test. Oh, joy.
Can we hang out afterwards, and can we all take a shot?
You are welcome to do whatever you would like. But you can't disrupt the people who are still testing. That's the only problem. So, yeah. I'll put you all in a breakout room to do shots together. Folks, we don't have quite everybody, but we are going to hit the ground running. Now, here's the deal, folks. Here is the little kind of wrap up the class spiel, okay? This is your last official class of learning, and we added in the extra day just for the test. We are going to finish the material, do the review tonight. So we are currently in the, and we'll just call it additional laws section. And so fair housing is definitely a testable thing, and it's an important thing. And there is, of course, the federal level and the state level. Now, I'll tell you this, historically speaking, the way that the test was separated, it was only ever tested, fair housing was only ever tested, as per what they told us, on the national side. I did take time last night and go back through kind of the groupings and the way they're testing stuff, and they are now testing the North Carolina side under the other North Carolina laws section. So you would potentially need to know that differentiation of those exemptions. So we started talking about fair housing, and so remember, the years matter. It all started with the Civil Rights Act of 1866, where they said no discrimination against anybody on the basis of race or color. There are no exemptions to that ever. So if you ever see a question that says that a seller refused to sell a business to somebody because they were white, that's a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. If they refused to lease an apartment to somebody because they were African American, if it's race or color, then it's a violation always. There are no exemptions ever. But remember, I told you there are plenty of exemptions to the Fair Housing Act, which means basically every other protected class can be discriminated against. On a federal level, for sale by owners, as long as they don't use discriminatory advertising, they can pick and choose as long as it has nothing to do with race or color, who they sell it to. The other big one that you have to be aware of is the roommate rule. And so that is if you are leasing a bedroom in your house or a unit in a duplex, triplex, up to a quadruplex that you also occupy. Okay, that you also occupy. Now, I will tell you one slight differentiation between the federal and the state in that regard. And I want to make sure I get this right. The federal says that you can discriminate based on, as long as it's not, any violation of the Civil Rights Act, if you live there. North Carolina says if you or a family member lives there. Now, it's kind of silly for it to say that, because you have to understand when a state piece of legislation and a federal piece of legislation contradict each other, the more restrictive will prevail. And so technically, even though North Carolina says that a family member living there would allow you to pick and choose who lives there, the federal rule says it's only if it's owner occupied for the roommate rule. So technically, you could see it on the test, but it's not enforceable. What you got, Sam?
So I kind of I was taking the quiz, one of the quizzes last night, and it said when an owner leases her property, she temporarily relinquishes the right to, and the answer was occupy the property, essentially, was the answer.
Mm-hmm.
That basically contradicts the roommate. What if I'm a landlord, but I've got a roommate who pays me rent?
Yeah, don't get too rabbit hole on this, because it wasn't a fair housing question. That was a leasing question. Remember, if I was to move out of my house and lease it to you, I have transferred the right to occupy, which is the right of possession, the right of exclusion, meaning you can keep other people from coming out, and the right of quiet enjoyment, saying nobody else can come in and take over this lease. So we're talking about if we relinquish full possessory rights, meaning I move out, you move into the house I own. Don't confuse that with a limited possession. Allowing somebody to live in your house with you, you have not relinquished full possession. You have given up possession of that one room. So that was not a fair housing question. That was a lease question on just giving up your right of possession. Yeah. Because remember, a residential landlord does not have that, the roommate rule doesn't apply. It's only if you stay occupying as well. So if you're a residential landlord leasing it to somebody, you can't discriminate. Remember, I told you fair housing only always applies to residential landlords and real estate brokers. That is the only person who always, the only people who always have to adhere to the fair housing law. Yeah. Yeah. So the exemptions, as I said, for the federal, and I'll move back to the slide really quick here so you can see it. On the federal, for sale by owner, as long as they don't use discriminatory advertising. The roommate rule, meaning renting out a room or up to, 3 units, because it has to be residential. So up to a quadruplex if they live in one, but they can never violate Civil Rights Act. Religious organizations, as long as they're not limiting who can join their religious organization. Private clubs used by members. And then I told you, never an exemption where the broker is involved. So if you get a question on a test that says,
I'm sorry, I can't see your window for some reason. What am I doing wrong? I can't see anything.
Everybody else can, right?
Yeah, Dora, it's probably in your settings. Do you see your own face?
I see everybody, and like the green block, it says you're viewing Seth screen.
Okay, but do you see anybody's face?
Yeah, I see all of you guys.
Okay, so, and you just can't see Seth? So on it, there's going to be a couple different things. It should be towards the left of it, and you can move that thing on your screen around. It might be either on the left or it might be on the top, but there's going to be a couple different things, and it's going to show grid or thumbnail or speaker video or hide thumbnail.
There you go.
Do you see those up there at the top?
As Jacob's saying, just play with your settings. That's all it comes down to. And then the other thing is, my shared screen might just be behind the faces. If you can grab the faces and move them, sometimes they're just seated over them. So I would just play around. She is logging in through a different device. I'm going to keep going. Hopefully she'll get that worked out. Good now? Okay.
Thank you. I can see now.
Good deal. So no exemption where the broker is involved in any way, shape, or form. And then I told you the federal fair housing and the state fair housing mirror very similarly. But of course, there's a slight differentiation there. And so you'll see that slide again in just a second. But I'm telling you, do not answer these with emotions. And so here's an example. Somebody renting to only females. Somebody refusing to rent to somebody from Chile. Somebody refusing to rent. All of that is not discrimination if these exemptions apply. Remember the other thing too, the federal fair housing is enforced by HUD. Somebody has up to a year after an incident to file a complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and they have up to 100 days to determine if they need to move forward with it or not. So, when we're dealing with this, of course, they take these things very seriously. If there was ever anything dealing with the Civil Rights Act, you'll see in just a second, the violations of Civil Rights Act go directly to federal courts because there is no exemption for those. Of course, these would go through this conciliation, which is basically where we try to resolve the dispute in a less legal manner initially. And then this last little note says fines and injunctions range from $10,000 for a first offense up to $50,000 for multiple violations within 7 years. Of course, lots of penalties there for any of these violations of fair housing. And then, as I said, Civil Rights Act, any violations there should be, this slide, go directly to federal courts. Now, before we get back into the last couple things in the North Carolina side, I don't know that I necessarily asked you this application question yesterday, so I'm going to ask it to see if you remember some of the things we talked about yesterday. So here it is. True or false? Age is a protected class under the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988.
False.
Okay.
I'm having a hard time with the dates and the what falls under what. That's one of the questions I got wrong on my practice exam.
Yeah, and you just got to flashcard that until you get it down. Age is not part of fair housing in any way, shape, and form. It is part of something.
ECOA.
ECOA. Age, marital status, and public assistance income dependence are the unique things to ECOA only. They are not protected under fair housing. What that means is that if you were to, folks, understand this, okay, because this is another place where people get messed up on the test. If it's not a protected class, it's not protected. So if somebody refuses to sell to somebody because they're an old geezer, they are not in violation of the Fair Housing Act. There is no protected class for old people under fair housing. Age is not a protected class. If somebody gets turned down because they are a military, that's not a protected class either. So if they are discriminating against somebody who's not a protected class, there's no violation. Once again, we don't like it. It's not pretty, but there's no illegalities there. What you got, Sam?
It is not. It said that is 98 and 18 specific. What that was like noteworthy. Because
yeah, you're gonna have to talk slower. Your computer's doing that thing again where you're just like.
And just don't worry.
Wait, hold on, wait. Hold on, talk slow. Because right then I could hear you. Try it again.
It is protected.
Okay. If you type it in the chat, Sam. I want to answer your question. It's just one of those silly things with internet. So don't get type it in the chat. I'll answer it. I promise I will. Just take a second, type it, and I'll come back to it. Yeah, it was an age question, but if you type it in the chat, I'll answer it. So, folks, here's the thing. While age is not a protected class in general, there is a very unique age thing that I'm about to teach you about, okay? And oh, I got you. I see what you're saying. Sam says, you said familial status is protected with a note regarding children under 18. Yes, but it's not necessarily, it's not age protections, it's child protections. It's because somebody under 18 is by definition a child. So, I mean, technically, yes, you're right, but don't ever read a question on that. Age is not the protected class. Familial status, people with kids, is the protected class. You cannot discriminate against somebody who has kids or is expecting kids. That's the differentiation. It's nothing to do with age. It's just, by definition, kids are under 18. So, yesterday we talked about it, and so we kind of discussed some things with familial status, and I told you, you absolutely cannot discriminate against people with kids. That is a huge violation of fair housing. However, there is one exemption to familial status. It's called HOPA, the Housings for Older Persons Act. Folks, I want you to think about the people who write the laws in the country. They are old as dirt. Look at our president, for the love of God. Man probably can't tie his own shoelaces, okay? And so our politicians are old. That being said, somebody decided that it was okay to pass a piece of legislation called the Housings for Older Persons Act. I guess they decided that they did their time with their kids. And so basically this states that as long as it meets certain criteria, certain communities can discriminate against familial status. And those criteria are any units that are solely occupied by persons 62 or older, meaning if the community is completely and utterly occupied by people 62 or older, they do not have to allow kids. Or even if at least 80% of the units are occupied by someone 55 or older. Either way, they do not have to allow kids. I'll give you an example of this. My grandmother, when she was alive, lived in a 55 and up community. And I was only allowed to visit for like 2 weeks at a time. That was in her restrictive covenants. Because I was not old enough to hang out there long term. And so this is the way that this kind of works. So as long as the entire community is slated that way and meets these limits, they are allowed to exclude familial status specifically. Now, please understand that it is occupancy restrictions, not ownership restrictions. I could own in a 55 and up community. You can't restrict who owns property, but you can restrict who lives there. So I would have to use it as a rental if I owned in a 55 and up community. I couldn't live there because the restrictive covenants say I can't. So it's HOPA, Housings for Older Persons Act. It's funny, in all my years of teaching, I never really cared too much about why this 80% thing existed. And then I had a student explain something or say something, and I'm like, oh my God, that makes good sense. You know what it is? 80%, that allows the couple people who are widowers or widows to remarry them younger folks. That's why they wrote that. They're like, wait. If we have that rule only, we can't marry younger people. Yeah, you're right, change it. At least 80%. 20 of us can have younger spouses. It makes perfect sense, right? Everybody's marrying them little Playboy bunnies, getting their little 20-something-year-old, you know, whatever, when their spouse dies at 92 or whatever. So, Housings for Older Persons Act. HOPA. Your dad, he married somebody younger, is that, or is he the older person? Oh, okay, well, yeah, there you go, a little bit younger. I mean, he didn't go 20, so I mean, he didn't go, not robbing the cradle or anything, so there you go.
My dad's been married 5 times. His 4th wife was younger than my son.
Me too.
Stephanie's dad, and apparently Monica's dad. Okay, Jacob, your dad.
Stepmom, that wasn't awkward. We had the same high school teacher. How weird is that?
Oh, awkward.
My daddy was 50 and she was 19. That's the issue.
Oh, ugh. Wow.
That makes me uncomfortable.
It does me too. Ask me again though when I'm 50. I might be completely fine with it. I don't know. I'll let you know. Justin, my grandpa was 78 with a 39-year-old. She was looking for you. Listen, aren't they all, Justin? At that point, that ain't love, okay? That disparity, I don't care what you say. Everybody's just in a symbiotic relationship. You give me this, I give you that, right? Money for, well, you get the idea. Anyway. So, I will talk about this for a second. Fair housing actually does require that new buildings be built with ADA compliance, okay? They have to basically be built where they can accommodate handicapping conditions. Of course, there are a lot of older buildings that are still in play. So buildings constructed before 1991 sometimes do not meet ADA compliance, and that's okay. They are grandfathered in because it's not necessarily practical to add, wheelchairs or things of that nature. And of course, wheelchair ramps and things of that nature after the fact. And of course, certain restrictions still, exist. You're not required to have elevators at every unit as long as you have, accessibility in the parking lots and wide enough walkways and things of that nature. So fair housing does require that all new buildings, multifamily, do meet ADA compliance as well. Even though it's fair housing, they have to be accessible for handicapping conditions. Now, We already talked about ECOA. I gave you that graph yesterday. Please keep those separate. ECOA deals with all lending. Fair housing deals with buying or renting, a place where you live. And then age and marital status and public assistance, income dependence are the three that are unique to ECOA. What that means, though, folks, is if somebody was, as I said, discriminated against because of age or marital status, that is not a violation of fair housing. Also be aware that disability/handicapping condition is not part of ECOA. So yet again, if somebody says, well, they were turned down a loan because they had a disability, that's not discrimination, or it's not illegal anyway, because it's not one of the things on here. Notice what else is not on this list, folks. It's the one that says not. Not. Familial status. That means if somebody was denied lending because they had kids, technically it's not a violation of ECOA, because familial status is not a protected class under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Marital status is, but disability and familial status are not part of ECOA. The rest of them are part of both. The race, color, religion, national origin, and sex are. And then the public assistance, income, marital status, and age are unique to only ECOA. You just got to kind of flashcard these for yourselves to help you make sure you got these down, because they get real confusing real quick, because it's similar discussions, similar overlaps, but not the same. Now, of course, I already said ADA. ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Basically, this is dealing with public, okay? ADA is everywhere. Places you work, places you go, everything in between. Fair housing deals with places you live. And so that's where I told you. ADA recognizes service animals, and they can go anywhere. Fair housing has to recognize service animals as well, and they can never be considered pets. But fair housing also has those emotional support animals that are sometimes required to be recognized. We're not going to get into whether they're pets or not, because that is a very complex conversation. Typically, no, they are not, but sometimes it's more complex than that. But understand, there's that differentiation, okay? ADA is public, where you work. It's the same reason why there's handicap stalls everywhere you go nowadays, because it's required under the ADA compliance in the public, okay? Here's a question for you as I kind of wrap up. I'm about to get into some other thing that I really need to tell you, but we're not there quite yet. Under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, lenders cannot deny a person from qualifying for a loan based on the number of children they have. True or false?
That's true. Wait, no, that's false. Marital. That's false.
I'm waiting for some more opinions.
It's true.
Depends on the number of heartbeats per room.
No, that's a HUD thing. That's not an ECOA thing. We're not talking about living anywhere. We're talking about borrowing money.
Based off the slide you just showed us, this is false.
Correct. It is false. Folks, familial status is not a protected class under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. It's false. So under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, lenders cannot deny a person. That's not true. They can deny somebody based on the number of kids they have. It would not be a violation of ECOA because it is not protected under ECOA. It sounds stupid to say it out loud, but it's false. They could deny somebody because of the number of kids they had. They could deny somebody based on a disability. Disability and familial status are not protected under ECOA. They are only protected under fair housing. So here's the other thing, and then I'm going to move into the last big thing, or here's the reminder, then I'm going to move into the last big thing for fair housing, okay? The North Carolina Act because I was looking through the syllabus, they do test you potentially on the North Carolina one now. The North Carolina Fair Housing and the Federal Fair Housing mirror each other very closely, but North Carolina says that a for sale by owner is not exempt, where Federal said it was. And then North Carolina says that a individual living in the unit or their family member living in the unit, the roommate rule applies. But Federal says no, it has to be the individual living there. And then, of course, the only extra thing for North Carolina is rental of same-sex dormitories. Basically, you are allowed to discriminate based on sex if it is a same-sex dormitory in North Carolina. And then remember, Federal is enforced by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. North Carolina Fair Housing is enforced by the North Carolina Human Relations Commission. Not the Real Estate Commission, folks. Do not let that word commission throw you off. Human Relations Commission. Sam says, does ECOA really only apply to lenders and banks? Yeah, and credit card companies. If you apply for an American Express tomorrow and they deny you, they have to send you a letter within 30 days because of ECOA. So any borrowing of money is what ECOA applies to. It has nothing to do with houses in any way, shape, and form, just borrowing money in general. Now, one last mention in North Carolina, and then we're going to talk about the big pieces of terminology that are testable in fair housing, okay? Just because there's so many like quirky North Carolina laws that could be on this North Carolina test, I'm going to tell you about this one. I'm going to give you basically the rundown, and it's going to sound silly, but hopefully it'll help you remember it. There is a North Carolina law against sexual harassment. It says unsolicited overt requests or demands for sexual acts or any sexual behavior that creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive environment. Folks, let me explain to you what this means. If you are a landlord and your tenant is having some hardships and you were to go up to them and say, well, I know another way that you could pay for your rent this much, we got a problem, okay? If you turn being a landlord into a Pornhub episode, then there are laws against that. So if you make it a hostile or uncomfortable environment with verbal assault, nonverbal harassment, sexual advances, or anything like that, there are laws that you could get in trouble for, okay? So just keep that in mind, all right? Now, if you're a pizza boy, it's fine. But living quarters, it's an issue, okay? Yeah, listen, on a side note, do you know how many people probably became pizza boys that were very disappointed that that's not really a thing? Like, this is the whole reason I became a pizza boy, and it's not happened once. Not once. Yeah, it's just the movie slick. Sorry. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, good on you. Your mama raised you right.
You're telling on yourself. You're telling on yourself, Seth.
Hey, I just know about pop culture, Misty, okay? I'm just a very diversified person. I know a lot about a lot. Doesn't mean I partake. I just know a lot, okay? I talk to people. Cue the cheesy 70s round chicka round round music, right? Here's the last thing, folks, okay? Let's talk about these. These are very, 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 very testable. Could potentially be testable on the North Carolina and the state side. These are all terminologies that you have to know in regard to fair housing. Have to, okay? Let me tell you what they are, and then I'll give you the slides that accompany them. Block busting, which is also called panic peddling. This is the act of trying to make somebody panic and move out of their area by saying something like, hey, listen, there's a lot of blanks moving in the area. Your property values are going to drop. You might as well sell now. That is block busting or panic peddling. You are encouraging people to sell homes and get out before the market tanks because the blanks are moving in, whatever that may be. That is highly illegal and a violation of fair housing. It's called block busting or panic peddling. Steering is where you try to guide somebody to an area, good or bad, right? It's still a problem, folks. There is no such thing as good steering. So it's basically saying, well, hey, Mr. African-American buyer, wouldn't you like to be in a community with predominantly African-Americans like yourself? hey, Mr. and Mrs. Asian descent buyer, wouldn't you like to be in an area where there's other Asian speaking people? That is called steering. If you try to take people to an area where you think they belong or you think that they feel more comfortable, that's highly illegal. It's discriminatory. It's a violation of fair housing. It's called steering. The clarity that I need to make sure you understand is even if they ask you to, it's illegal. If they look you in the face and say, I want to be with other Asian families, I want to be in an Asian community, it's still illegal for real estate brokers to take them there. Our only appropriate response is, well, I don't know where that is, but you tell me which community you'd like to be in, and I'm happy to take you to go look at homes. We are not allowed to take you to people like this, people like that, steer you away from, to. That is a problem, okay? It's called steering. Of course, advertising means anything that would be deemed as discriminatory advertising. Folks, be careful because some things are very harmless, it seems. I told you yesterday, like saying walking distance could be discriminatory advertising because not everybody can walk. Saying, close to Christ Baptist Church. Well, that's implying that it's better for a Christian versus somebody who's Muslim or Jewish or, whatever it may be. Even visuals can be discriminatory advertising. If you see an advertisement for a community that has a golf course and it's a bunch of old, uppity white people on the advertisement, it's kind of saying something, isn't it? So advertising can be discriminatory. If it doesn't hit all people the same, it's a problem. We were kind of talking about that yesterday. No kids, that's an issue. Fixer-upper would be fine. Handyman special, that's a problem. Able-bodied only, you can't say things like that. And then the last one is redlining, okay? Redlining is more commonly done with loans and sometimes insurance. It's basically where a lender's got like a map and they'll basically say, okay, well, this area right here, that area is the ghetto. We don't fund loans there. And so let me give you an example of what a test question like this could look like for redlining. Joe Buyer has gotten pre-approved with ABC Lending Company. He's looked at several different homes, and now he wants to put an offer in on one. He puts an offer in on an area that, he likes, but, seems like it's rough. Upon looking at the address on the paperwork, the lender decides that Joe is no longer qualified to buy this house. What might this lender be guilty of? Redlining. Because now they've automatically denied him, even though he was pre-approved, just because of the address. You see what I'm saying? So this could be true of insurance. This could be true of lending. It is basically, there's an area we don't do business in. That's redlining. So here's the visual for you. As I said, blockbusting, also called panic peddling, encouraging people to sell or rent based on certain protected classes moving into the neighborhood, stating that they would have a negative impact on the values, the community, or otherwise. And steering, sometimes called channeling. I haven't seen that on as many practice tests. I'm not going to say you're not going to see channeling, but panic peddling you will see as equally as much as you see blockbusting. Steering is the more common term that you're going to see on the test for this one. And that's why I said trying to steer them towards people like themselves or trying to steer them away from people not like themselves. Even at their request, it's still illegal. On a side note, did everybody see that I uploaded the slides and the license law and commission rule slides last night? Everybody saw that? Okay.
Yeah, I also put in the group me. I don't know if you saw, but I still would love that link for the video.
Yes. I will put it on. I'll put it in there when we take our first break.
Okay.
Yep. And then advertising, discriminatory advertising would be a problem. Okay, if it doesn't hit all of everybody equally, if any protected class feels different at the way that you advertise it, it's a problem. It's probably discriminatory. Okay, advertising should hit all protected classes, all demographics, all people with the same weight. Should not feel any different to anybody. And then the last one, as I said, redlining. That is where I told you most commonly utilized with lending practices, refusing to lend in a certain area, could be insurance sometimes as well, based on the detriment of that economy, the demographic makeup, the, whatever it may be. Now, the last kind of discriminatory note that I'll give you here, I told you yesterday, if, people do check this. Sometimes landlords, property owners are very shady, and they will do sting operations to figure out if they are, and they'll go and they'll send certain protected classes in to ask if there's any vacancies, get told no, and then they will send a different person there, and then they get told yes. That is highly illegal when you sell somebody it's not available anymore, because they are not the type you were looking for. Refusing to sell, rent, or lease based on a perceived protected class or actually a protected class, big problem. So I told you residential landlords and real estate brokers always have to adhere to fair housing. 0 exemptions for either of those. So let me make sure you're comfortable, and then I'll talk about the one last little thing that really needs to be said in these grouping of slides, and then we'll switch to the North Carolina stuff. Okay. This is the practice of using the changing neighborhood demographics to influence a person to sell their home.
Blockbusting.
Blockbusting. Jacob, you ever been in a blockbuster? No.
Not.
Yeah,
I've never seen one.
Yeah.
I know what they are and what they were,
but
I think I've never been in one.
Read it in a history book one time. I saw that.
No, I just remember red boxes.
Red boxes, yep, those were popular for a while. They still exist, which blows my mind. It's crazy because I was on the Redbacks wagon for a long time. I'm like, why would I do it on my TV? And then I'm like, this is so much better to just do it on my TV. It's like, if they do it long enough, they'll eventually get you. How about this one? Family asks you to show them homes only populated by a specific ethnic group of people. This is considered steering. Even if they ask you, it's a problem, folks. You are welcome to show them homes, but it should not be based on any of these different things, okay? So I told you the other things in this one, of course, this is talking about the code of ethics for realtors. That's not going to be like a very crazy thing. The other sections in this grouping, the federal income taxation and real property ownership. Let me just give you the quick Cliff Notes version of these, because this is not crazy testable to the umpteenth degree. When we're dealing with home ownership, of course, there are advantages other than appreciation and equity. And I think I may have said this earlier, but when you own a house, your interest that you pay on your first home and a second home, if you have it, is typically tax deductible. So you can actually deduct that if you itemize your deductions. Now, folks, please understand what a deduction is. If you are making $100,000 a year, and let's just use the home interest as an example. Let's say that you pay $15,000 towards interest between your first and second homes in a year. Well, when you can deduct something, what that basically says, okay, you made $100,000, so you owe taxes on $100,000, but you deducted an allowable expense, and so now you're really only paying taxes as if you made $85,000. That's what a deduction is. It's not a credit. You're not getting that money back. It's just reducing your taxable liability. So if you can deduct what you have to pay taxes on, that means your tax bill is lower. You may have grossed $100,000, but if you've got additional deductions up to 40 grand, you're only paying taxes on making 60 grand. That's a deduction. So mortgage interest on first and second home loans are tax deductible. Discount points paid are tax deductible. Any prepayment penalties paid, origination fees. Now, of course, the discount points and origination fees, they're only paid in the year that you close on the house. Mortgage insurance premiums, that's an annual thing. Those are tax deductible. And of course, real property taxes are tax deductible because it is already a tax that you're paying. So the government can't double dip in things that you're already paying to another government. So all of these are deductions. So lots of benefits to homeownership. You've got all these tax deductions. You can depreciate investment properties, which is an increased tax deduction as well. You can have cash flow. You gain appreciation. There's benefits. Now, I will tell you this. The test has changed, but historically, the Real Estate Commission told us that there is no longer any math on the next topic that I'm going to talk about, and it is capital gains. So I'm not going to teach you the math. It's a moot point. I'll give you the breakdown of it, but you shouldn't have any math on it. So a capital gain, folks, is when you make money on an investment. If you buy a set of stocks for $1,000 and turn around and sell them high for $10,000, you made a capital gain of $9,000. Okay? That is just the way this works. What you make on an investment. Well, houses are considered an investment. And so if you sell a house and you make money, it is called a capital gain. If you sell a house and you lose money, it's called a capital loss. Government says you made money, pay us some taxes. So they break capital gains into two categories. Short-term capital gains, which is money made in less than 12 months. If it's less than a year, it's a short-term gain. It's taxed at a higher rate. If you've held the property for longer than, or the stocks for longer than a year, it is called a long-term gain, and it is a lower tax rate. Of course, it is still not a small tax rate. But the coolest thing and probably the most testable thing about capital gains that you have to be aware of is a tax exemption that exists, and I told you that yesterday. If you are selling a piece of real estate or real property that you own, and it has been your primary residence for 2 out of the last 5 years, you have an exemption up to $250,000 as an individual and up to $500,000 as a married couple, where you do not have to pay a penny in capital gains. Which means if you sell it and you made a capital gain of $260,000 as a single person, you would only be paying taxes on $10,000 because you had that $250,000 exemption. It's probably the most testable part of this capital gains is understanding that this exemption exists, and it is not for rental properties. Have to have lived there. Those 2 years don't have to be consecutive, I told you. Now, I'll give you the math equation in a nutshell, but you're not going to have to calculate it. Folks, if you buy a house for $200,000, does it only cost you $200,000? No. There are typically closing costs associated with it. So let's say that you bought it for $200,000, and then you had closing cost of $6,000. Well, what you bought it for, plus your applicable closing cost, we would call that your cost basis. Basically what you paid for that property. Okay, it's called your cost basis. Now, sometimes there's an extra layer to this. If you were to do capital improvements to your property, like a new roof, a modification, gutting it, let's say $30,000. Well, that is money that you spent to make the property what it is, and so you can add that in if you spent money on that property. And that is what we call an adjusted basis. So now it's what you have invested into that piece of property. It's called an adjusted basis. When you sell your property, well, folks, let's say that you sold this property for $400,000. You're not actually making $400,000. You've got commissions, you've got other closing costs. So let's say that you've got a total of $30,000 in closing costs. So that means that your amount realized is really only $370,000. So the way that you calculate capital gains is you take your amount realized, which is this number of $370,000, and you subtract out your adjusted basis, what it actually costs you to invest that into that property, $236,000, and that's what your capital gain is. The reason that works that way, folks, is because it's not fair to charge you gain on money that you didn't actually make. So your capital gain is only $134,000. If we were not to do it with this formula, $400,000 what you sold for, $200,000 what you bought for, you'd be a lot closer to that threshold, and that's not really fair because you really didn't make $200,000. Now, you may need to know those terminologies, and I'll give you the slide for it here. Cost basis, And then if you add in your capital improvements, that would be called an adjusted basis. If you don't do any capital improvements, you would just use your cost basis. And that's where you start, what you have invested in this property. And then when you sell minus applicable closing costs, that's called your amount realized. So the way that you calculate your capital gain or your capital loss is amount realized minus your adjusted basis. But they told us that they're not doing the math on that. It would used to be that you know, like you bought it for this, you did capital improvements of this, you sold it for this, you've owned it for this much time. Yeah, how much would you owe taxes on? They said they're not doing math anymore, so we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. So here's the other part. Amount realized minus adjusted basis. And so your sales price minus your closing cost gives you your amount realized. So I told you there are slides that exist in your online program for your construction chapter. I doubt they're going to be really doing anything crazy on the construction chapter if I had to guess. But I will just skip forward and show you the 3 things that I think you would probably be most interested on in the new construction. And then we'll switch into North Carolina. I would say you need to know this. Major types of foundations for construction: concrete slab, basements, and crawl spaces. Crawl spaces are, you know, built with walls. You have the little access point and you can crawl around in there. Slab is exactly what it sounds like. It's just poured concrete that's pretty thick. And then basement is typically much deeper and wider than a crawl space. Most of the time your basement, if you have one, it can be finished or unfinished. It is what we call below grade space, because it is adjacent to dirt on some of the walls. So remember, when we talked about those square footage guidelines, any wall is adjacent to dirt, it's called below grade. As long as all of it's above the dirt, it's called above grade. Now there's more than just that, but you need to know those main 3. I would tell you the other thing that's really testable here, not all this stuff, is, well, I like the slides that I have in the other one better. Let me see if I can find it here. The components of the foundation is what I'm looking for, and I don't even see it in here, which is your piers, your footers, and your foundation walls. Okay, piers, footers, foundation walls are the components of the foundation. Footers are the concrete that you trench it out and you pour the concrete down below the frost line so it doesn't expand and contract as much. So those are your footers, and that's what everything of your foundation is built on. Piers are built within and on their own footers, and that helps distribute the weight for subflooring, you know, the main girders and stuff like that. And then the foundation walls are what we actually see. Now understand that when you see the brick foundations, that's actually decorative on the outside. Real foundation, the actual part that you don't see, is cinder block, rebar, and concrete. So you need to know the components of a foundation, which are footers, piers, and foundation walls, at least for crawl space. And then you also need to know, trying to think here. There's a good visual in your online program. I put those in there that I liked of the eaves and the framing. We'll circle back around to that. Like I said, this is very matter-of-fact stuff, so you'll be fine. So here's where we need to have some in-depth conversations about North Carolina. Now, the good news is we started having some of these conversations very early on in class. Big, very testable thing is who needs a license. Well, we've spent a lot of time there already. So we're going to remind you who needs a license, because that's exceptionally testable in today's day and age on the North Carolina portion of the exam.
Seth, is that NC license regulation, chapter 25?
Yes.
From our book?
Yes. Yeah, so
That's the LLCs, right?
yes, LL Beans is what we're going to get into. The book does a great job of like hitting all of the North Carolina stuff, and they kind of break it out. When you hit chapter 25, chapters 25 through like 30 are all North Carolina stuff that you can be tested on. And we've got the quizzes. I very much recommend, folks, the quizzes for North Carolina in the online learning program. There's a lot of them, but they will save you on your North Carolina portion of the exam. Even if you're not going to get everything complete, listen to me right now. You need to do the quizzes in the North Carolina section of the online platform. Yeah, I promise you do. What you got, Jacob?
After we pass your class, which we will all be doing on
There you
Friday. Do we still have access to this?
Yeah.
Can I still go back and do these practice tests
Absolutely.
over and over and over again?
At minimum, you have a year of access to this online program.
Great.
Yep.
That's all.
Yep. Good question. Misty says there are quizzes in the back of the book also. Misty, most of the not all of them, most of the quizzes that are built into the online platform, they're the same quizzes that are in the back of the book, just in a much more user-friendly interface way, and that also shows me that you did them. So they should be the same quizzes for all intents and purposes. There's probably a few extras in the rest of the platform, but yeah, a lot of the same quizzes. But yes, those are great quizzes.
Yeah, and I did see where some of the questions online came from the book.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So there's, some overlap there, but yeah, great quizzes. So let's talk about this, folks, and I'm also going to go off on some tangents and talk about other things that I think are very important North Carolina-wise, okay? So think about this. I'm circling back around. We have done a lot of things throughout the class where I've talked about North Carolina stuff. We had Chapter 10, which was about the sales contract specifically. We've talked about North Carolina specifically in the taxation. We've talked about North Carolina specifically in some of the property management. So we've been talking about North Carolina from the word go. But this is an opportunity for me to remind you some very in-depth North Carolina things, to talk some other specific laws and rules, because it is so specific. And you've got to pay very careful attention. So when we talked on day 1 and day 2 about who needs a license, we all said, and you remember, that the general rule of thumb in North Carolina is if they're doing an LL Beans activity, list, lease, buy, exchange, auction, negotiate, sell, and it deals with real property for others for compensation, a license is required. And remember, it does also include referrals. If you offer to do these things, do these things, or refer somebody to do these things, a license is required. But remember, folks, if you are missing one, you don't need a license. Josh is buying his own house and negotiates a $6,000 bonus as the buyer. Does Josh need a license?
Say it again, I'm sorry.
Josh is buying his own house and negotiates a $6,000 bonus paid to Josh from the builder. Does Josh need a license?
No, because I'm selling my own house.
Buying your own house, but yes, that's exactly right. Folks, it is real property. Josh is getting money, but it's for him. It's his transaction. Okay? How about this? Manoj manages his grandmother's rental property because he loves his grandmother. Does Manoj need a license?
No.
Yes.
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 Well,
Is he
it is assumed. Now, wait a minute. It's assumed that he's going to get paid, or do we say...
Don't assume anything.
So, we need...
You take the questions at face value. Did I say anything about money?
No.
No. So I'll ask you again. Manoj is managing his grandmother's rental property because he loves his grandmother.
No.
No. No license needed. It is real property.
Making money.
There you go. It is real property. It is for somebody other than Manoj, right? Manoj's grandmother. There is no compensation. If one piece is missing, you do not need a license. How about this? Let's add in some of the more complex exemptions we talked about at the beginning of class, 6,000 years ago, okay? Jacob is an employee of Awesome Builders Incorporated, and Jacob sits on site and sells the homes that Awesome Builder Incorporated owns. He shows the properties to potential buyers and negotiates with them and gets them under contract. Did Jacob need a license?
Yes.
Yes, negotiates.
Negotiate, yeah.
You didn't say how. I'm
No,
getting.
he works for the builder.
You didn't.
I said employee. That's all I needed to say.
Okay.
No.
So then no, I don't need a license.
There you go.
Then I would be a W-2 worker.
That word is enough.
An employee could not negotiate.
Remember when I gave you the Microsoft example, folks? Microsoft can own real property, and Microsoft, any employees of Microsoft could sell their own property. Remember the business entity exemption, that 93A-2. Let me see if it's in here. Why is this in there twice? No. Right here. Employed by an entity owner of the real estate. That is a named exemption. An entity is selling their own. He works for Awesome Builders Incorporated. So it's basically Awesome Builders Incorporated is selling Awesome Builders Incorporated house. It's the same as a for sale by owner. Jacob is an extension of Awesome Builders Incorporated. He is an employee. Talk to me, Misty.
Okay, so for some reason in my mind, I got if he can show property.
You're thinking of the employee of a broker property manager. They can show property for lease, but they cannot negotiate. So that's where I told you they are a very limited, see that limited exemption. Don't confuse the two. Because a full-fledged employee of ABC Builders, they're the same. They are ABC Builders. Jacob could negotiate because it'd be, think about it, Misty. If you sell your house right now without a license, are you going to negotiate with a buyer on what they're going to offer you?
Yes.
Yeah. Are you going to show it for sale?
Yes.
Yeah. Are you going to get under contract with them?
Hopefully, yes.
Yeah, hopefully, right? And so ABC Builders is no different than you. It's just that Jacob is ABC Builders because he's an employee. There is nobody else that could be Misty Benson, though, right? So you cannot hire an employee as an individual to do those things, but an entity that owns their property as the builder does, who has an employee, that employee can negotiate, can show properties for sale, can get them under contract, because they can do everything that the owner can do. They're the same person.
Okay, so it's entity where I was thinking about a property manager.
Correct. An entity owner can, right? An employee of an entity owner can do everything an owner can do. Now, folks, that is very testable. Very testable. Very testable, okay? You got to know that stuff. So, the general rule of thumb, let me backtrack here, is if all three of these exist, a license is required. If one of these is missing, a license is not required. And that's quite literally how it'll be spelled out. So let me help you out this way, okay? If a Virginia broker assists their mom in buying a house in North Carolina and gets paid a $500 Visa gift card for helping, is that a problem?
Yes.
Yes, because they are a Virginia broker. They are not licensed in North Carolina. They're nobody in North Carolina. So that is an unlicensed person helping with real property, somebody other than themselves, and they got something of value. A license is required. Everybody with me? So this was the reminder right back from day one. If you are doing it for yourself, no license is required. If you're doing it for somebody else, but you're not getting paid, no license is required. But if it's real property for others for compensation, a license is required. Remember, we asked these, well, actually, I'll give you the question when you get back from break. Go take a break, come back at 7:25. So just a couple more little recaps in this, and then we'll get into some other North Carolina discussions. Okay, we're talking about licenses. Do you need a license? It's going to be a very big and testable piece of this. And so the general 3 criteria, but of course there are some of those exemptions that come into play as well. But here is an example. Steve knows his brother is interested in purchasing a new home and sends him to an active real estate broker who will represent his brother in the purchase. Upon closing, the broker sends Steve a $100 Visa gift card. Would this be okay without a license, or would a license be required?
License would be required.
A license would be required. Because it is real property for others for compensation. This referral was the brokerage activity, referring somebody to buy, getting paid for it, somebody other than yourself. But this one, Susan manages a house she owns and books all the tenants and negotiates the rent amounts. She saves a lot of money managing it herself. Is this acceptable, or is a license required?
Acceptable.
That's acceptable.
There you go. It's her own property. Of course, she's making money off of managing it herself, but it's her own property. That's okay. She can do everything as the owner. So the big exemptions are the entity owner. Be very careful. When an entity owns real property, any hourly, salary, employee, owner, manager, whatever you want to call them, can act on behalf of that entity. And so it's the same as the entity owner doing it themselves. And that's why the builders are okay, legally speaking. Now, folks, it is possible and very common in North Carolina for a broker to be representing a builder, but don't let that confuse you on the test. It is okay for an employee of the builder to handle the builder's sales without a need for a license, as long as they are, in fact, an employee. Now, the other big exemption is the employee of the broker property manager. So, in other words, there is an apartment complex or a rental property. They hire a property manager who has a license to manage the property, so that's lawful. And then this broker property manager will hire an employee to work under them, a W-2 or salaried employee. They can only be paid on an hourly or salary basis, and they are a very limited exemption. There are certain things they can do, like show properties for rent, like give you these pre-printed lease forms to sign, like collect tenant security deposits and rent checks and deliver them, and answer basic tenant questions. All of those are okay. No, they could not negotiate, because negotiations would be a brokerage activity. Remember the other couple exemptions: anybody in a court-appointed authority, a trustee, an executor, or anything like that, guardian, conservator, all of these people may be doing real estate and getting paid, but because they're legally appointed. An attorney in fact, that's fine. An attorney practicing law, that's fine. So just keep those in mind, folks. These will be very, very specific questions on the test, and you have to answer them as such, because there's going to be several where you're like, oh no, that's it. Gotta be careful. Okay, read through all the choices, because these will trip you up. We've already talked about that one. That's employed of broker property manager. How about this one? An unlicensed property owner may compensate an unlicensed person to show rental properties and collect rent on their behalf, as long as the unlicensed person does not negotiate on behalf of the owner.
No.
False.
There you go. False. Unlicensed owner trying to hire somebody to do leasing, that's still brokerage activity. Even though they may not be negotiating, still brokerage activity. Real property for others, getting paid for it. Nope, that's a problem. Need a license. Here's the other place we started in North Carolina. Okay, different statuses. You get your license issued on which status?
Provisional broker.
Yep, provisional. And then if we wanted to supplement it, you would also be on what other status?
Inactive.
Inactive. How do you activate your license as a provisional broker?
By becoming affiliated with the bank.
Right, affiliating with a broker in charge will get you.
90 hours.
No, it's not active.
No.
90 hours moves you from something to something else, but the only way that you activate as a provisional broker is affiliating with a broker in charge. How do you move from a provisional broker to a full broker?
Complete the 90 hours.
90 hours of post-licensing education. How long do you have to complete those 90 hours of post-licensing education?
18 months.
18 months. There you go. So remember the differentiation on the test. The salesperson is equivalent to a provisional broker. Broker is almost equivalent to, well, a BIC, but you won't ever see that on national. So a broker is somebody who can operate independently. So on the national side, you will just see the salesperson and broker. On the state side, there's provisional broker, there's full broker, which is also known as a non-provisional or just broker. Okay, those three mean the same. And then there's the broker in charge. Now, folks, the provisional broker, that's how you get your license issued, provisional and inactive status. You move from provisional to full broker with those 90 hours of post-licensing. The way that you activate your license, as you said, affiliating with a broker in charge. This course is required to get there. Now, the other thing to understand is that when you are a provisional broker, the broker in charge is responsible for providing active and direct supervision. So if you get in trouble, your BIC is also in trouble. That's that supervisory thing, those training wheels. I told you, think of them as mommy and daddy BIC. So a couple other notes on provisional brokers. This is important, okay? Remember, provisional brokers cannot be duly affiliated with multiple firms except in that one rare instance where it is with a team BIC and a firm BIC in the same physical office location. They could not be affiliated with two brokerage firms in general. Has to be supervised by a broker in charge, and except for that one exemption, have one broker in charge. They cannot receive compensation from anybody other than their broker in charge in any way, shape, and form. And so that's where if you get questions on the test, if they get a check handed to them, depending on the context of the question, it's either that's a problem, or if they hand it over to their BIC and endorse it to their firm, then it's okay. The point is they just can't accept that money directly. It would potentially have to go to the BIC first. The other thing that I'm going to add into this mix here, even though it's not necessarily the same topic of conversation, remember, when we're talking about dual agency in North Carolina, a provisional broker cannot do designated dual agency against their broker in charge. But a provisional broker can do designated dual agency against a full broker. They can do designated dual agency against another provisional broker. And they can do dual agency with anybody. Just throw that into the mix. What you got, Jacob?
Can a, because you said that they can't accept payment from anybody, so they can't take referral fees?
No, not directly. They would have to go to the firm. Like, they can be paid for referral fees, but they can't have their referral checks cut to them directly. The referral checks go to the firm, and then they get paid from the firm. Yep. Now, one other side note here, which you could see on the test, your post-licensing courses are only good for 2 years from the date that you take them. So let's say that for whatever reason you don't get them all done within 18 months and you're sitting on inactive status. Well, you take one and you wait 2 years to take the others to try to fix and become a full broker. That one has expired. Post-licensing courses are only good for 2 years. Here's that exemption that I told you about. Broker in charge, provisional broker can't have the supervision for more than one BIC except for that one special circumstance. Team BIC, firm BIC in the same physical office location. The other big thing that comes in here is, of course, the different statuses, understanding active versus inactive, current versus expired. So here's a question for you, and then I'll go off on a tangent. Provisional broker who does not complete the required 90 hours of post-licensing education within 18 months of licensure will have a what type of license?
Expired. Or no, inactive, right?
Inactive, yes.
See?
Inactive. Inactive is how you start as a provisional broker, but it's also what happens if you have education deficiencies. If you don't take your CE on time, you'd go inactive. If you don't take your post-licensing on time, you'd go inactive. Currency, money keeps you current. Failure to pay expenses will make you expire, okay? So you can be, remember, if you are current, you could be current and active, which is the only status that you can do real estate on. Or you could be current and inactive, which you would not be able to operate because of an education deficiency. When you are expired, meaning you don't pay your dues, that is a standalone status. Doesn't matter if you've done your education, we just call you expired. Okay, just expired. How about this? True or false, a provisional broker may dual affiliate with their local firm and a licensed team entity that works within the same office location as the local firm.
True.
True. Team BIC, office BIC, same physical office location. If it was not in the same physical office location, that would be a no-go. This is that one exemption, okay? How about this one? Broker Bobby must be a current North Carolina realtor to earn compensation for a real estate transaction.
No. False.
Yeah. It's not about being a realtor, it's being an active and current broker, right? Brokers can get paid even when they're not realtors. You don't have to be a realtor to be compensated. Remember the differentiation. You're an agent because you represent people. You're a broker because you get a North Carolina real estate broker's license, and you're a realtor if and only if you join a trade organization called the National Association of Realtors. All realtors are brokers, but not all brokers are realtors. So let's talk about the broker. You take all your post-licensing, you will move to full broker status. Folks, a couple big reminders here, okay? When you are a full broker, can you operate independently?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. But what can't you do?
Advertise.
What else?
Have a trust account.
Have a trust account. What else? Affiliate other brokers. Affiliate other brokers. No employees or other affiliated licensees. So that is very testable, folks. If you are a full broker, you can go out as a sole proprietor and do brokerage activities. So long as you are not soliciting or advertising business, so long as you are not having a trust account, and so long as you are not trying to affiliate other brokers, you can go out. So do not answer a question that says a full broker can't do real estate on their own. Yeah, they can. It would just have to fall in their lap. Past clients that know, non-solicitation. Other things, folks, understand that they cannot do listings. They can help unsolicited buyers. They can collect referral fees, but they can't do listings. Listings require what? Advertisement. How are you going to tell the world you got a listing? Advertise. Can't do that. So an individual broker acting as a sole proprietor would have to designate as their own broker in charge or designate a broker in charge if they wanted to do any of those things. Hiring people, having a trust account, advertising services in any way, shape, and form.
Can they manage the property?
So this is where I said an individual broker, in theory, I'm not going to say they can't be a property manager. However, it's next to impossible to be a property manager unless you are a BIC, because you're going to advertise the property for lease, requires being a BIC. You're going to have a trust account to hold other security deposits, requires being a BIC. They don't talk about it a lot on the test, but realistically, yeah, you basically have to be a BIC to be a property manager. So I will add in another supplemental note. This changed in 2021. The provisional broker rule has been around for a while, meaning a provisional broker cannot be paid by anybody other than their broker in charge. That's been around for a long time. Back in 2021, they changed it and they said, okay, well, we used to say that a full broker could be paid directly from other people. What that meant was we would get our portion of the check from the attorney at closing, and then we'd take our firm their portion of their check. Nowadays, even a full broker, if you are affiliated with a firm, all monies go through the firm. Okay, so we can legally be paid directly as a full broker if we're not affiliated, but if we are affiliated with a firm, all monies still go through the firm even as a full broker. Next big status thing to talk about is the BIC qualifications, folks. Of course, that is the next tier up in North Carolina. You're not going to see the term BIC on the national licensing exam. So in order to qualify to be a broker in charge or BIC eligible broker, remember the only difference between the two, a BIC is actively overseeing themselves or somebody else. BIC eligible means you are sitting at the ready to do so. That's the difference. Same criteria though. So you have to be a full broker on active status. You have to have 2 years of full-time experience within the past 5 years. And you will ultimately have to take a 12-hour broker in charge course. Now, the 12-hour broker in charge course is not the same as the BICUP course, but there are 2 options for taking the 12-hour broker in charge course. You can take it up to a year in advance of designating as a BIC or BIC eligible broker, or you could take it 120 days after you designated as a BIC or BIC eligible broker, so long as you met all the other criteria. So understand, I doubt they'll go this in depth, but your time as a provisional broker does count as long as you are active in practicing. They're not going to test you on what full-time is because who really knows, but 2 years of full-time experience, or they also say 4 years of part-time experience. Now, there are lots of things that the broker in charge is responsible for if you haven't figured it out yet. Trust accounts, advertising, transactional records, agency statuses, agency disclosures, all of these, and provisional brokers, of course. All of these things are day in and day out broker in charge responsibilities.
So I thought that you said that the firm can't hold where is it? The accounts, like escrow money and stuff.
A full broker who is not a BIC can't have a trust account, but a firm with a trust account absolutely can.
I thought you were saying that the trust account had to be a third party and it couldn't be. Okay, well, never mind then.
A lot of times it is. It's an attorney, but at the end of the day, we have to just treat the money. It's other people's money is the key point. It's other people's money, but it is not a requirement that it has to be an attorney. Very common, right? Coldwell Banker HPW holds earnest money. Even though they are party to the transaction, that's okay because we have certain rules that we have to follow for safeguarding that money. So it doesn't have to be a third party. Very commonly is a third party like an attorney, though. What you got, Misty?
Just for clarification, do you have to be under a BIC as a provisional broker to take your 90 hours?
No.
Or can you be inactive and take your 90 hours?
You can be inactive. That's an excellent question. You can be inactive and not affiliated and still take your 90 hours of post-licensing. Absolutely. True or false, a non-provisional broker working for Pericle Realty in Charlotte may receive a referral fee directly from their brother, who is an active broker in Wilmington, North Carolina.
False.
There you go.
False. As of 2021.
There you go. As of 2021. There you go. I like it. Thumbs down. Even full brokers now, all the money goes through the brokerage firm. If you are affiliated, it has to go through your firm, and then it goes to us. If you are not affiliated, yes, you can be paid directly for referral fees that you did lawfully. So let's talk about the trust money. Since y'all had questions on it, we got to talk about this anyway. There are a lot of trust account rules, folks. Now, I'm going to explain something here. Okay. There is Rule 58A.0116, Rule 58A.0117, Law 93A-12. There's a lot of laws and rules that go hand in hand with trust monies. So I'm going to tell you kind of an interesting thing here. The way that our trust account rules are written is actually built around property management. And then what we do in sales transactions is more of an exemption to the rule or an exception to the rule. Let me explain. As a real estate broker, if we, under normal trust money circumstances, were handed a check that was made out to somebody else, we are not supposed to act as a courier and take it. So if you are a property manager and a tenant hands you a rent check that's made directly to the owner, we're not supposed to act as a courier under normal trust account rules and then take it to them. What needs to happen is the checks are supposed to be made out to us and our trust account with that property owner's property as the memo. And so then that way we deposit them into our trust accounts, allow them to clear, and then disperse them to our clients. That is the way that trust account rules are written. We are not supposed to act as a courier handling monies addressed to others. It should be given to us to go into a trust account. Once it clears, we will disperse it to our clients. Does that make sense for everybody? Well, the exceptions to that are earnest money deposits and due diligence fees. We are allowed to act as a courier for those. So the buyer hands us the due diligence check and we can take it directly to the listing agent or the seller. Somebody hands us the earnest money check and we can take it directly to the escrow agent, whether that be the attorney or the firm. So earnest money and due diligence are exceptions to the base rule that if we get handed money that's addressed to others, that needs to go in our trust accounts and clear first before we disperse it. Everybody still with me? So when we talk about trust money, the definition is just monies belonging to others. Tenant security deposits, rents, HOA dues and assessments, and then of course earnest monies. All of these are potentially examples of trust money that we would handle on a daily basis. And so when we're saying trust monies, this is not due diligence fees because that goes directly to the seller. We're not holding on to that. When we say trust monies, it is important to remember trust and escrow, same thing. It's an account open where other people hold your money. So when you remember on the closing disclosure kind of discussions and the initial escrows that we talked about in the pity payments, well, you give money to your bank to open an account in your name. So that's your money. It's an escrow account, just like this is. So trust account, escrow account, same thing. They are always separate from your account. They are custodial, meaning you have taken custody of other people's money, and they're available on demand. You cannot spend the money in there. They're supposed to just sit there where they can be taken out without prior notice. Okay? Separate, custodial, and on demand. So, when we're dealing with a trust account should be in a bank that is lawfully doing business in North Carolina. However, the bank does not have to physically have a branch in North Carolina so long as it's lawfully doing business in North Carolina. Has to be FDIC insured depository. So typically you cannot put them in credit unions that are not FDIC insured and things of that nature. So lawfully doing business in North Carolina. The bank also has to agree to turn over trust account records to the Real Estate Commission upon request. If they just show up and say, give me the records for ABC Realty, they have to say, yep, no problem. Now, here's where we get into some of the more, technical things, folks. A firm is not required to have a trust account. However, if they're going to be holding any trust monies, they would need one. And as I said before, it would basically be impossible for a property management company to not have a trust account because they're taking tenant security deposits. Now, you do not need more than one because all trust monies can be deposited into the same one with the exception of multiple or separate homeowners associations. If you are managing homeowners associations for multiple different neighborhoods, each one of those would have to have their own dedicated trust account. But your earnest money deposits from 700 transactions can go into the same one. Your tenant security deposits can go into the same one. So you only need one trust account as long as you're not managing multiple HOAs. So, true or false, a real estate firm in Oak Island, North Carolina may have one trust account to hold their earnest money deposits, security deposits, and collected rents.
True.
True. That's okay. You would only need separate ones for multiple HOAs. So, here's where we get into some of the other rules within here, okay? When we're dealing with trust monies, there's kind of some unique rules. Basically, what it comes down to, let's say that you were to hand over a earnest money deposit check to somebody with an offer. Well, you can hold that check while we're waiting to see if that offer becomes a contract. But you have to deposit it, if it's an earnest money deposit, within 3 days of contract formation if it's a check. If it's cash, you have to deposit it within 3 days of receipt. It's kind of a unique thing.
What is the difference between that? Can you explain that? The 3 days within receipt and 3 days within contract. What did you say? Contract.
Yeah, contract formation. So if you are a listing agent, Jacob, and I have an offer for a buyer, I'm saying, here's my offer, and they're offering $5,000 in earnest money that your firm's going to hold. Here's the $5,000 check. It is not uncommon to hand you the check with the offer, so that way you have it if you decide to accept it. Well, you can just hold on to that check because it's just an offer. It may not become a contract. So let's say a week later, you're still holding on to that check and your sellers decide...
Hold on to it. Do you mean physically?
Physically hold on to it.
Check, not deposit.
Not deposit it. Just a check. So you can hold on. I forgot your age. This check thing might come difficult, a little more difficult. It's a physical piece of paper, Jacob. It's called a check.
However, I have never used one.
There you go. You can hold on to that check. Let's say a week later, your seller decides to accept the offer. After the offer is accepted, you have to deposit it within 3 days of that acceptance. Okay, you can hold the check, because that check is made out to somebody very specific, and the nature of checks is a little more protected. So you can hold it, but once you accept it, you have to deposit within 3 days. Now, if I was to come to you, Jacob, and instead say, okay, well, here's an offer, and here's $5,000 in cash for earnest money. You have to deposit that cash into your escrow account within 3 days of me handing it to you. You are not allowed to hold on to it until we form a contract like you can a check. That's what I mean.
10-4.
Yep. Now understand, folks, that you're not breaking any rules, because the whole point of trust accounts is it's other people's money. If you deposit it, even though we don't form a contract, you would just let it clear, and then you would just give the money back to the appropriate party. So you're not in trouble for depositing the money even if you don't have a contract yet. Now, these general trust account rules are the general trust account rules. Of course, when we're dealing with any test questions, please understand that a provisional broker is not allowed to go and deposit money into the trust account directly. And more than that, when the provisional broker is handed anything that is considered trust money, the general rule of thumb is it needs to be delivered to the appropriate party immediately, typically their broker in charge. You do not get a 3-day kind of grace period as a PB. If this money touches your hands, take it to the appropriate party, typically your BIC, immediately. Couple more rules here. Trust accounts, they like to test on these. There's a couple pieces of terminology that we have to throw in the mix for trust accounts, just like with every other topic we have. But first, let's just point out, trust accounts, like I told you, are custodial. They're where we hold other people's money. Well, as such, they have to have the name trust account or escrowed account on the name of the account, which means it would also have to be on any deposit slips and statements as well. Okay, has to contain the name trust or escrow account and the title. Now, there are two things that are highly illegal that are very specific terminologies that you absolutely will be tested on. One of them is called commingling. Commingling is when you mix your money with other people's money. And so that's why we have a separate account. We put other people's money in that one. That's our trust account. Our money stays in our own personal accounts. If you were to ever mix the two, that is called commingling, and it is highly illegal. It is a big problem. Now, it says there is an exception for $100. You can have $100 or up to $100 of your own money in a trust account, and that is to cover bank fees. Anything in excess of that, it would have to remove. On that note, you are allowed to utilize an interest-bearing trust account, meaning it makes money off of holding other people's money. You would have to disclose that it's interest-bearing and what you intend to do with the interest. You can keep it, but of course, if you intend to keep it, then you would have to regularly remove that interest so that it did not exceed $100.
That you not have to have permission from the client to have an interest-bearing account.
You do not have to have permission from the client to have an interest-bearing account. You just have to inform them that you have an interest-bearing account. Yeah. You have to disclose it to them and disclose what you're doing with the interest. But we're not going to ask permission. This is an interest-bearing trust account. Are you okay with that? If they say no, then we can put it somewhere else. But we're not asking permission. We're just telling them this is an interest-bearing trust account. So let's look at this question here. True or false? Buyer writes a $5,000 check to Pericle Realty Trust account as her earnest money deposit. The non-provisional broker receiving the check must deposit the check within 3 banking days of receiving it.
Well, the provisional broker can't do anything but give it to the bid.
It says non-provisional broker. It's not that. It's a check and not cash. So they have to withhold. It's contract.
I will provide some clarity on this one because I don't necessarily love the wording because they're trying to like double trick you here because it does say non-provisional. The thing is, it doesn't tell you has to check the Pericle Trust account as her earnest money deposit. The non-provisional broker. This is, either way, folks, this is false because, of course, the brokers, provisional or non-provisional, are not depositing the check. It needs to go to the escrow agent, whether that be the broker in charge or otherwise. And then, of course, this doesn't give enough details to say whether we're under contract or not. So I don't love this question. It's not very fair because if we're under contract, then it does need to go within 3 days of being delivered. But it doesn't say whether we're under contract or not. So if we're not under contract, you could hold on to it. I don't love that question. I apologize.
It is very tricky because it says the check is written to the Realtor Trust account. Which is fine. That's where it's supposed to be written to. Whoever's holding it, it's fine. The problem for me is they don't tell you whether you're under contract or not. Because if you're not under contract and it's a check, then you can continue to hold it until offer acceptance. So I don't love this question. I apologize. I will make a note and kind of add some different verbiage to that. So the last couple things with trust accounts, we talked about this on the offer to purchase and contract form 2T. Folks, you know that if we're using that North Carolina contract, the 2T, if the buyer was to terminate during the due diligence period, what monies is the buyer entitled to get back?
Earnest money?
Only.
Earnest money only. Conversely, if the buyer was to terminate after the due diligence period, what monies are the buyers entitled to get back?
None.
None. Now, regardless of the fact that we know who is supposed to get it and when, if there is ever a dispute, we have to keep holding it. Yes, we know who's supposed to get it. But let's say that the buyer terminates during due diligence period and they're supposed to get it back. If the seller refuses to sign the release, we would have to continue holding it until all parties agree to its disposition. So we cannot do anything except hold it, or 93A-12 says we can deposit it with the clerk of court and say it's your problem now. Those are your options. So we keep holding it until Judge Judy tells us to give it to somebody, they come to an agreement, or until we get fed up with it and turn it over to the clerk of court. Now this next one is a double-edged learning point, folks. It's still trust accounts, but it's also another rule into the mix. I told you, and let's see if you can remember, how long do you have to keep records for in North Carolina?
3 years after last date of contact.
Yeah, date of last activity. So in the case of disputed trust funds where a judge orders the funds to be dispersed, the brokers would need to retain those transaction records from 3 years from that date. Not 3 years from the day that the contract fell through. 3 years from the disbursement of the funds. That would be the date of last activity. So if I give you a test question that says, the deal didn't close on this date, they were battling for a year, the monies was dispersed on this date, it would be 3 years from the date the monies were dispersed. The last action. That's when your 3 year clock starts. Well, I'll just answer this one for you. You tell me. Can a bank/firm have an interest-bearing trust account?
Yes.
Yes, as long as?
You have to inform.
There you go. As long as they disclose it. You got to tell them that that's what's happening. How about this? Can a bank or firm have a trust account with a credit union?
No.
No. Has to be FDIC insured depositories. I'm not going to say that no credit unions are that way, but they're typically not. That's the whole point of a credit union. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to throw in the mix for trust accounts. Let me think. Oh, the other term that you could see that did not show up. Commingling is mixing your money and other people's money. There's another very important one called conversion that is very illegal. If you were to pay a bill of yours out of your trust account, it's called a conversion, it's illegal. So if on a test question it says, the broker in charge cuts a, $400 check to pay their utility bill that much for the firm out of their trust account, that's called conversion. That's very illegal. Conversion versus commingling, both very, very illegal. Quick mention here, LNCL, remember that is a certain license, limited non-resident commercial broker's license. It is the only thing, one of the only things that sounds exactly like it is. It is for people who do not live in North Carolina, who are actively licensed in another state, to come in and do commercial brokerage only. They have to file a declaration of affiliation and a cooperation agreement with a resident broker prior to getting this license, and they would have to renew this license every year for as long as they stayed in North Carolina to do that commercial brokerage. Just like any other license, has to be renewed every year. Let me make sure you're with me on this. True or false, a broker who is actively licensed in Minnesota may receive a limited North Carolina broker's license to participate in the purchase of an investment beach home in the Outer Banks.
True.
False.
Okay, so that's the commercial, right? Isn't it commercial?
It's false because it should say limited non-residents commercial.
That's going to be investment property, so I think it's false.
Yeah.
It is relevant whether it is an investment or not. If it falls under the definition of residential, which is a 1 to 4 unit dwelling, then no, they can't do this. So, not okay. This is...
Explain, please. I'm confused on this one.
Because they're not purchasing commercial real estate. The definition of commercial is anything greater than 4 units or raw land. They are purchasing a house. Yes, it may be an investment property, but it's not a commercial property. What you got, Kirsten?
Is this a North Carolina rule? Because I know somebody who works both here and in a different state as a broker. And in the other state, this person predominantly helps people purchase investment properties. So I'm just curious how that works.
Well, it depends on what you mean. They help them purchase it with a special type of license, or they help them purchase it in general. It's okay to run your business with helping people purchase investment properties, but that doesn't necessarily make it a commercial purchase. You got to understand that a house that's an investment is still a residential house. The house that I live in, if I turn it into a rental tomorrow, it's still a residential dwelling. So don't confuse commercial, which is in North Carolina defined as greater than 4 units or raw land, with investments. Those are different. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Like a North Carolina broker can help anybody do anything in North Carolina, right? I could help people with commercial. I could help. There's no special license. But what this is saying is this person is getting a commercial broker's license and they're trying to use that to help somebody buy a residential property. Doesn't work.
But it doesn't say commercial.
So if I have a residential license, just so I can clarify, I can work here and in, let's say, Virginia. I can broker in both states.
No.
No.
This is a very...
I'm not the one who does this, so how do they do that?
Don't worry about your personal life because that's going to confuse you. They may not even be doing it legally. You got to understand that, number one. But number two, they probably have a license in both states.
Okay, so you could...
You can be licensed in all 50 states if you want to.
Okay.
But this is saying they don't want to come in and go through the same thing y'all were coming through.
Gotcha.
This is a special, like, we will let you play in our sandbox as long as you have a North Carolina broker supervising you, and as long as you promise to only play in the commercial sandbox. Don't you dare try to play in this residential sandbox. Yeah. It's a special license they can apply for.
Is that considered reciprocity?
No, it's not full-fledged reciprocity because it does expire and it's very limited. I mean, I guess you could call it a limited level of reciprocity, but on a more specific level. Yeah. What you got, Jacob?
I still don't understand because it doesn't say anything about commercial in that question.
It says beach house. Beach house. What do you do in a beach house? What do you do in a house?
You live there.
You live there. Residential property. Their license is only good for commercial.
Yeah, so, okay, but it doesn't say anything about, it doesn't say anything about commercial, though. And, because isn't there also a limited residential where you can...
No, I see what you're saying. Because it didn't actually spell out LNCL. It just says limited NC broker's license. The only limited NC license that exists is the LNCL, the limited non-resident commercial license. Otherwise, you've got a residence license, and you would be a provisional broker, a full broker, or BIC.
I guess that's my confusion, because I thought that you could also get permission to, from state to state, potentially sell homes if you got the permission to.
No. No, sometimes they have what Tim called reciprocity, where having a license in one state will allow you to get a license in another state. But that's not the same thing.
I think this is why I was also confused. So we're on the same.
Yeah, there's no such thing as a limited residential license. So it just didn't throw in the word commercial, but it's talking about the limited non-resident commercial license. That's the only limited license that exists in North Carolina. So they just left out some words, but it was implied because there is no other limited license. You are a, yeah.
Makes more sense.
There you go. Folks, remember license of business entities. An entity is not a sole proprietor, okay? Sole proprietors never need a firm license because they have a broker's license. Very important. But when you create an entity, whether that entity be to transact real estate brokerage like a full-fledged firm, Keller Williams, Coldwell Banker, whatever, or whether that entity was created for compensation purposes only. If it is collecting payments for brokerage, it needs a license. Entities get a firm license. So you create an entity with the Secretary of State, LLC, corporation, partnership, and then if you wanted to do brokerage activity or get paid for brokerage activity for that entity, you would need a firm license. Now, if you've got a broker's license and a firm license, that is 2 renewals that you have to do every year. So some people will create an entity, like an LLC, get an EIN number, create bank accounts for that entity, and then they will want to get their commission checks paid into that business bank account. They cannot do that unless they get a firm license. Because remember, the definition of a broker is any person, partnership, limited liability company, or corporation who does those LL Beans activities, real property for others for compensation. We can all agree that this entity is being compensated for brokerage activity, ergo it needs a firm license. Sole proprietorship never needs a firm license. But an entity that has been created to do brokerage activity or get paid for brokerage activity needs a firm license. Now, I don't think we got into this yet, so let's add an extra layer, folks. Can a fictitious thing like a company sit in the same class that you folks are sitting in?
No.
No. No. So the way that these entities get their licenses is by having an owner that qualifies them to get a license. We call that person the qualifying broker. If you are the owner of the entity and you have a license, you can qualify your entity to get a firm license called the qualifying broker. Do not confuse this with the broker in charge. The only requirements to be a qualifying broker is to be a full broker, which means that as soon as any of you take post-licensing after you get your license, you could create an entity for compensation purposes. Because an entity created for compensation purposes does not need a BIC, because it's not advertising, it's not affiliating with other brokers, there's no employees, it's solely for getting paid into.
But if you do want to advertise anything from your company, you do have to either be a BIC or hire a BIC.
Correct. So, how about this one? Let's see if I like this one. That last one I didn't like. True or false, a North Carolina non-provisional broker wishes to start their own LLC for compensation and liability purposes. Once they have successfully registered their LLC with the Secretary of State, they may apply for their firm license with the North Carolina Real Estate Commission.
False.
I would say true.
It's true. The only criteria to apply for a firm license is to be a non-provisional broker. This person is. They have an entity created with the Secretary of State. They are a full broker. They can apply for a firm license. Now, if it is created solely for the purpose of compensation, they will get that firm license and they'll be good. If they want to start a brokerage firm or advertise like Jacob said, they need an extra step. They would have to designate a broker in charge of that firm. Now, the other thing that we need to talk about is the dates. Remember, folks, the way that North Carolina does these things, okay? Our year for licensing runs from July 1st to June 30th. July 1st to June 30th. So we are currently in the 2023-2024 licensing year. So we will be in a new year starting on July 1. When you get your license, that is called a license issuance. And every single person has to renew their license by June 30th of whatever year we're talking about. So even you folks, if you all get your licenses in March, you will have to pay your $45 renewal fee by June 30th. That is what we call your first renewal. So now in July 1, you are in what we call your second renewal year. Every broker has to start taking continuing education after they have renewed once, or in other words, in their second renewal year, which means every single one of you who gets licensed before the end of this year, you will renew, and you will need CE, which is comprised of a 4-hour update course, 4-hour elective course by June 10th. Very specific deadline. June 10th in your second renewal year. So then you will also have to pay your renewal fees again on June 30th. Every year, $45 by June 30th. Paying that renewal fee is the currency that keeps you current. Failure to pay those expenses make you expired. What you got, Misty?
So we have to take the continuing education and the 90 hours.
Correct. But the post-licensing is a one-time thing, whereas CE is until the day you die. Starting in your second renewal year. So education is the difference between active and inactive. Money is the difference between current and expired. And I told you expired is standalone. If you are expired, you are nothing else. Doesn't matter if you are good on education. If you are inactive versus active, you could also be current, okay? Current and inactive. And the only one that you can play real estate on is current and active. Now, one last note here. They cannot, will not, and won't not teach CE between June 10th and June 30th. It's called a blackout period. So if you miss your CE on June 10th, there is nothing you can do to prevent from going inactive on July 1. Your license will remain active for that year, but you will go inactive on July 1. And of course, there are punishments for these. If you go inactive because you missed your 8 hours of education, when the new year hits, you're inactive, okay? And then they will say, okay, take your 8 hours for this new year that we're in, so 4-hour update, 4-hour elective, and then take 2 4-hour electives to make up for the 8 hours you missed. Meaning you have to take a total of 16 hours of education before you could reactivate your license. Now, I'm going to give you another really important thought to realize while we're talking about this, folks. If you go inactive, you must cease and desist all brokerage activities. So picture that. If you're in the middle of a transaction and you forget to take your CE and the transaction's still going on July 15th, the new year, you're inactive. You cannot participate in that transaction at all. North Carolina is very specific. If you do any real estate activity while you are inactive or expired, you forfeit your rights to a commission. Furthermore, you are subject to disciplinary action. However, everybody listen to me. Let's say that you go inactive on July 1. Your closing is set to happen on July 7th. Your firm is technically the agent. So let's say that somebody else in your firm finishes out that transaction because their statuses are okay. You can be paid for things that you did do while you were current and active, so long as you did not do any illegal brokerage activity after you went inactive or expired. It's important. You can be paid on inactive status so long as it's for brokerage activity you did while you were current and active. So active means good on education, or if you're a provisional broker, that means you are affiliated. That is the only status in which you can play real estate. Got to be current and active. Inactive happens if you fail to pay, you fail to take your CE, or if you never affiliate with a BIC as a provisional broker, you'd be on inactive status. Or if you fail to take your post-licensing within 18 hours. If you pay your dues, you'd be current, but you would be inactive due to education. I told you if you miss 1 year of CE, they make you take 16 hours before you can reactivate. If you go longer than that, let's say you keep paying your dues, but you don't take CE and it's been more than 2 years, they punish you even more. Education can always be fixed. But if you go 2 years, they say take 2 post-licensing classes to make up for your missed hours, plus this year's update. And this year's elective. So, active versus inactive. Let's talk about expired. If you fail to pay your expenses, every year, everybody's license will expire on June 30th. But they only reissue you a new one, legally speaking, if you paid your money. $45 every year. So if you fail to pay it, July 1, you are expired. It's the same as having no license at all, which is why we say that's the standalone status. You're not active, you're not inactive, you're just expired. That's all you are. Now, they punish you on this one too. It is automatically double. Instead of $45, it's now $90 to fix this. You have to answer some questions, and then you would have to reactivate with a form. Now, if you let your license go expired for more than 6 months, they punish you. You would have to pay the $90. You would have to do a new background check. You would have to take the state licensing exam again, and you would have to do a reinstatement application. You could also elect to take a post-licensing in lieu of the state licensing exam. That is if you're expired 6 months up to 2 years. If you let your license go expired for more than 2 years, you're back in this class. You would have to pass this class, you'd have to pass the state exam, you'd have to do another background check, a new application, everything and then some. Now, I don't know if that's going to be on your test, but technically speaking, if you were a full broker and you went expired for 2 years, you would be reinstated as a full broker. But if you go expired for more than 3 years, you will always come back as a provisional broker. And this is just reiterating, all licenses expire on June 30th. You got to pay that money to get your new one. Just pay it online. I think we're good on this. What you got, Jacob?
I just did my background. I just submitted, but I completely forgot until you just now said something about it. When is the best time to do the application?
To actually take the state licensing exam?
Is that different? No. You said application in there.
I was talking about reinstatement applications. Your application to get your license, you have to get that done before you can take the state licensing exam. So as soon as your background check comes back, you can finish your application, and then you will get what's called exam eligibility and go on to take your state licensing exam. You can't finish the application, though, until you pass this class and get the code I have to give you to finish the application.
Gotcha. Okay. So once my background check gets back, I can finish the application using your code, and then do I have to wait for anything, or once I submit it, I'm good to take the test?
You just have to wait until they come back and say they've granted you your exam eligibility. Okay. And then you're good to schedule the test. Yep.
How long does the background check usually take to come back?
Some people in here said that it took them like 7 days.
Okay.
Mine took 3.
3 days?
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm back in 2.
2.
I just did it yesterday.
Yeah. Okay.
But it also depends on if you
complexity.
lived in another state, if your military background, a whole bunch of other stuff makes a difference.
I did.
Mine came back the next day, but it said, "Oh, you need to pay more because you live in California, and, Pennsylvania." So,
there you go.
Okay.
That's what they do. There you go. So it's pretty quick. You'll get it back soon.
Before we move on, that code we're supposed to get, will we get it in that email when you let us know if we pass?
It will not be the one that is on the score that you'll get that night. My office admin has to go and punch it in the system, and then she will send you out an email that says you have successfully passed the class. Here's the code to do your application on the Real Estate Commission's website. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. True or false, North Carolina broker has not paid their $45 renewal fee for the past 2 years. To reinstate their license, they will need to complete the current year CE requirement and 60 hours of post-licensing.
False. They have to start all the way back at pre-licensing.
There you go. Expired for more than 2 years back in pre-licensing. That's right.
Hey, that's Dora.
Hey, there it is. That's right. That's how it goes.
And Misty.
And Misty, that's right. And Misty. Next, we're going to, we're going to talk about some of the components of the Real Estate Commission next, but this right here says a license may be suspended or revoked if obtained by false or fraudulent representation. Basically, if you lie about criminal convictions, try to hide things on your application, of course, they will say, well, you're crazy, we'll take your license back. So that's what that's talking about. There are, of course, a lot of rules and laws like that. But when we get into the commission itself, folks, when I keep talking about going to the Real Estate Commission's website, or if I say call the commission, if I say, things like that, what you'd actually be talking to is what we call the commission staff. The commission staff. And the commission is actually a group of people. So it's easy to think of it like a business or, something like that, but it's a governmental agency, but more specifically, it's a group of people. Now, folks, if you ever get any question that talks about why the commission exists, it's to protect the public from real estate brokers. The commission will the answer to the question will never be that they're going to help us. It will never be that they're going to reassign a transaction. It will never be that they're going to help us fight for our money. That will never be the answer. The Real Estate Commission exists to protect the public in real estate dealings, more specifically from real estate licensees. It is the enforcing and oversight agency. They're the ones that issue licenses. They're the ones that discipline licensees. They're the ones that do all of this stuff. So you got to have that mentality. The commission is an oversight agency for licensing and an enforcement agency protecting the public. Got to answer a question like every question like that. Now, when I said it's a group of people, it is specifically 9 people. The commission is comprised of 9 individuals. Now, I owe you a break, so I'll tell you about the 9 individuals when you come back. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to finish this last little thought, and then I have more slides, but of course I've shared them with you. Now, folks, please don't think that the slides that I'm not going to get to, we've talked about a lot of it. Okay, like North Carolina, we have been talking about it from day one. But you've got to think back to some of the conversations we've had about, okay, this is national, this is North Carolina. What do I mean? You're going to have some very specific dual agency versus designated versus a provisional can versus they can't scenarios on the agency side of North Carolina. You're not going to have those same difficulties on the agency side on national. Dual agencies on both, but of course we have very specific laws and rules on the North Carolina side. Like provisional broker can or can't, act as a designated agent. Same thing too, we've got very specific North Carolina tax things, right? The mandatory octennial reappraisal, where we have to reassess tax values every 8 years in North Carolina. And then we can do a horizontal reassessment every 4 years. And then we can change the tax rate every year, not the tax value. So we've been talking about North Carolina stuff from the word go. So I'll point out one thing after we talk about this last piece. Okay, we haven't talked about this yet. So when we're talking about the Real Estate Commission, let me turn this light down. I feel like I'm very bright. There we go. That's better. When we talk about the Real Estate Commission is 9 people, and they are what we call voluntary positions. You get appointed as a commission member. I've met all 9 members of the commission. I would consider them nice people unless you're up on the chopping block next to them. And so here's what you need to know. There are 9 people. That's testable. You need to know that 3 members of the Real Estate Commission at any given time have to be real estate brokers. You also need to know that 2 members of the Real Estate Commission at any given time cannot be involved in real estate, meaning they are not real estate brokers. The reason for this is some diversification, because if it was all brokers, they might start making decisions that were only good for us and not the general public. So it's kind of designed to make the decision-making process a little more subjective. So, or less subjective, should I say. So 3 members have to be real estate brokers. 2 members cannot. Well, folks, what that means is, if you do the math, up to 7 members could be brokers at any given time, because the only requirement is 2 cannot. So don't get that confused. 3 have to, 2 can't, but that doesn't mean that less can't, right? You see what I'm saying? It could be greater than this. Now, the other thing that you need to know is 7 of them are appointed by the governor of North Carolina. It is a government-appointed position. You are not going to be a commission member unless you are buddy-buddy with the governor himself. He appoints 7 of them. One of them is appointed by the Speaker of the House of Representatives in North Carolina. And one of them is it says the President Pro Tem, the President Pro Tem of the Senate of North Carolina, which is basically the head honcho like the Speaker of the House, but for the Senate versus the House of Representatives. So all 9 of them are appointed by some governmental body at the state level. And the other thing that you really need to know about them is, as I already said, they are looking out for the public, not for us. So don't you ever answer a question where they are looking out for us. You will get it wrong. But think of it this way. The Real Estate Commission giveth, the Real Estate Commission taketh away. They're the ones that issue your license. And they're the ones that can remove your license. Now, there is a smattering of other things that they can do in regard to your license, in regard to your day-to-day functionality. So they are the ones who are going to license all of you. They're going to approve you through your application. If you have anything on your application, they're the ones who you will do a character review with if you go and talk to them about anything that comes up on your background check or otherwise. And of course, when we're talking about sanctions, and we're talking about things that they can do to your license, they can suspend your license, they can reprimand your license, basically putting a formal disapproval on your record. Suspend means take it away for a period of time with the intention to give it back. Revoke means take it away. They can put limitations on your license as well. A limitation may say, okay, we'll give you your license back, but you can't do property management for 2 years, or you can't be a broker in charge for 3 years. That's called a limitation. So they can do all that. Now, it's very important to remember that the Real Estate Commission will never fine real estate licensees. Never, ever, ever, ever in North Carolina. But there is somebody we talked about that they do fine. Who remembers?
Timeshares.
Specifically, the person, what party? Because remember, there's a couple. The developer. Yeah, the timeshare developer, which is not a real estate broker. It doesn't need to be a real estate broker. They will fine timeshare developers fines of $500 per violation of the North Carolina Timeshare Act. Now remember, the developer does not need a license, but the person selling the timeshares does need a license. So it's just a review tangent there. So basically, they're the oversight agency. They're informing and educating the public and brokers. They are regulating business activities under this brokerage in North Carolina. And of course, they can investigate brokers breaking laws and rules and unlicensed persons trying to do brokerage activity, which would be a Class 1 misdemeanor. Licensed law is criminal law. So if you are doing any illegal brokerage activity, you've committed a Class 1 misdemeanor. Now, of course, they don't have the power to prosecute. They would have to turn that over to the Attorney General for prosecution if they wanted to. So here's a list of things that I said they could do. Censure and reprimand, they've basically grouped those together now. It's basically, you're in trouble. That's it. It's on your record, you're in trouble, you messed up. And then the other things, suspend, revoke, and of course put a limitation. In a nutshell, that's what you need to know about them. So, let's move on into wherever y'all want to go. Like I said, folks, you really make sure you spend a lot of time. Let me show you this. And we may utilize this for the review, but I told you the syllabus is a really great way to gauge yourself. And so on the North Carolina piece, we've been talking about it throughout, but definitely go through in your studies and look at this license on commission rules. So we've been talking about basic licensing, these different statuses, what requires a license, what doesn't, the exemptions, the purpose of the commission, continuing education, statuses, prohibited acts, all these things that would get you in trouble, being unworthy or incompetent, self-dealing, misrepresentations and omissions, very testable, folks. You got to know the difference between misrepresentation and omission and whether or not it is willful or negligent. We talked about that back in the agency. So we've talked about a lot of these things throughout. So just make sure you kind of skim through here. Make sure you're comfortable. Here's where we're talking about trust accounts, some of the provisional broker things. So let's switch gears, folks. Let's see what we can get through. Let's talk about any and every topic, whatever y'all want to talk about. Let's start there for review purposes. Sorry, my allergies are like acting up, and all of a sudden I can't like breathe out of my right nostril.
So Seth, I have a question about the HO2, HO4, 6, 8. So like HO2 covers 16 different items. Will we be tested possibly on those 16 items, or we just need to know?
For the insurance policy? You're talking about insurance, right? Yeah. No, you're not going to be you're not going to be tested like in depth on those items. The biggest thing to understand is basically that an HO2 only covers the named things. An HO3 basically covers everything except certain things that they name. So that's kind of the difference. One's a coverage policy and one's an exemption policy. So you need to know that. You do need to.
HO3 also covers personal property. Right?
There you go. It also covers personal property as well. So you're not going to get like super in-depth conversations there. You should, anything you'll be able to kind of navigate pretty well without having that list committed to memory. You do need to know things like civil disruption, fires, storms, wind, that all of those are covered under your HO3, vandalism, theft. So you may need to know more of those, but the HO2 is not a whole really testable that much.
Okay.
Yep. What you got, Jacob?
I'd like to go over a little bit of contract stuff.
Okay.
One of the biggest ones I think for me is just knowing a little bit more about the 2T.
Mm-hmm.
Like when exactly is that used? Because I know that's not the only contract that's used or can be used, but just like when is that used? I mean, that's kind of I know that's the most common one, but is it considered like standard?
Yeah. So let me give you a quick little spiel on it, and you tell me if it helps, and then I'll supplement, okay? You need to know that in North Carolina, we have Rule 58A.0112. You don't need to know that number, but it is called the Sales Contracts Rule. That rule states that a broker acting in North Carolina can use any pre-printed sales contract so long as it contains 19 required provisions and so long as it does not contain 2 prohibited provisions. You absolutely need to know that the 2 prohibited provisions are no disclaimer of liability by the broker and no discussion of brokerage compensation. We talk about our compensation where?
In our agreement with our buyer.
There you go. Agency agreements. So there's the blanketed thing where you have to understand that there is no set contract we have to use. You can use any one so long as it meets that rule. Now, more specifically to answer your question, the offer to purchase in contract form 2T is utilized for resale residential. It would be acceptable for a resale townhome, a resale single family detached, a resale condo, a resale mobile home that has become real property and attached to land. It is good for resale residential. That's what you would use it for. And it is the vast majority of the one we use the vast majority of the time. The other big things you need to know, there is a 7-day delay in settlement built into that contract for a delaying party where they're not considered in breach. You need to know that due diligence is due on the effective date. You need to know that earnest money is due within 5 days of the effective date. You need to know that due diligence periods are a times of the essence concept. It runs through 5 p.m. on whatever date we negotiated. If a buyer terminates during due diligence, they are supposed to get their earnest money back because they have purchased the unilateral right for that due diligence period with any due diligence fee. That fee is non-refundable in almost all circumstances. Of course, they get it back at closing. You'd have to know that due diligence is a double entry item on the settlement statement. It is a buyer credit, seller debit. Okay. If the buyer terminates after due diligence, now the buyer is in breach. They have forfeit both due diligence and earnest money. You have to know that if we were talking about contracts in general and the property burned down for a sales contract, that typically would kill a sales contract. But on the 2T, the sales contract does not automatically die with destruction of the property. Remember, the buyer could terminate due to the destruction of the property and be entitled to get their due diligence and earnest money back, or they could proceed with the purchase and be entitled to the insurance money as well as the damaged house. That is very specific and important compared to the general sales contract side of things. So there are a lot of very specifics. You also need to know about the potential for the buyer to have the right to terminate within 3 days of the effective date if they have not received the property disclosures under the Residential Property Disclosure Act. The property disclosures have to be given to the buyer prior to making an offer, and if they're not, buyer can terminate within 3 days of the effective date or 3 days from the day they received the disclosures, whichever occurs first. You also have to know that the contract is an as-is contract. There are no negotiations in it automatically. There's no contingencies in it automatically, but you could potentially put other addenda in there, and you could potentially negotiate repairs as part of your due diligence. Does that help?
Yeah.
I've been teaching this for a while. Sometimes it's death by information. I apologize. What else?
I mean, I have plenty, but I want to give everybody else a turn.
Yeah, let's see. Don't be shy now. Step right up. Step right up. Come on. Come on.
Seth, can you talk about a little bit about the IRMA?
IRMA. Yep. Yeah. IRMA. IRMA is the total circumstance test. Folks, it is a legal test. That means the courts use it. If the courts are doing it, you have already messed up as a real estate broker. Because our job is to clearly identify what stays and what goes in a contract. Well, if IRMA's coming into play, we have missed that. So the courts will use these criteria and these criteria alone to determine if it was a fixture or not. Intent of the annexor. Remember, annexation is taking personal property and attaching it to real property, and it becomes a fixed or fixture. So intent of the annexor, the person who attached it. Relationship of the annexor. Was it a tenant that installed it? Was it the owner? Method of attachment. How permanent is it? Lots of screws, lots of nails, studs, right? All that stuff. And then adaptation to the real estate. How weird would it be if you removed it from this real estate? Is it custom to this piece of real estate? Those are the only criteria they consider. And so the courts will use those criteria to decide if it was a fixture or not, to decide if they are going to award it to the seller or award it to the buyer based on this argument they're having. Remember, size, location, and value mean nothing. Those are not considerations in this at all. Does that help?
Yeah.
What else?
The Macaroni Act.
Machinery.
Yep. Oh my God. Can you tell I'm tired? Yeah.
Macrame. Crocheting. Knitting scarves.
It's on, yeah. Yeah, Jesus.
That's okay. I'm like, at first I was stumped. I'm like, I don't know anything about a macrame act. I don't know. Machinery Act.
Because I got a question wrong on the practice exam. Maybe that's why I got it wrong.
maybe it is. The Machinery Act is the act that gives the powers to the local municipalities to impose real property taxes. Remember, real property taxes are local in nature. Your counties, your towns, your cities. It is not big federal government that taxes your real property. It is your local government. So the Machinery Act gives the local governments the powers to tax real property every year. And in North Carolina, it is what we call a real estate ad valorem tax. It is intended to be the assessed value, but it's not. I mean, it's basically the tax assessor does their own appraisal. And so your tax value has zero correlation with what you'd actually pay for the property. So the ad valorem tax is paid every year. And remember, the rate has to be the value has to be reevaluated every 8 years. North Carolina has that mandatory octennial reappraisal. Has to be reassessed every 8 years. The value does. It can be redone across the board. It's called a horizontal reassessment every 4 years. Across the board, meaning a whole municipality, they can't just pick and choose your house or your neighbor's house. Has to be across the board, can happen every 4 years. But remember, the tax rate can change every year, which is why in North Carolina, we don't consider our tax bills due and payable until when? Yeah, there you go. I just saw you mouth it. September 1. September 1, because they actually haven't set the rate until like July. So once they set it, they'll tell us what it is, and then it becomes due and payable in September 1. So that's the Machinery Act. It is basically governing the real property taxation in North Carolina.
Gotcha. The Macaroni Act.
The Macaroni Act. I like it. What else?
Seth, can you just run through the freehold estates? I know that I know it, but I just want to hear it.
Yes. Freehold estate is an estate of ownership. Leasehold estate is also called a non-freehold estate, is an estate of lease, not of ownership. We just talked about those in the property management and the tenant and landlord section. But freehold estates are all estates of ownership, okay? And now we break those into several different categories. Highest and best form of ownership is what we call fee simple absolute, okay? Fee simple absolute means there is no restrictions on the length of your ownership. There is no restrictions on the use. That doesn't include private and public land use controls. It just means there is nothing you can do to destroy your ownership, and it will not go away unless you decide to do it. Fee simple absolute, highest and best form. Then we've got the other fees, which is fee simple defeasible. And fees of that, there is two categories. What is the other name for fee simple defeasible? There you go, Misty.
Qualified fee.
There you go, Manoj. Qualified fee. Fee simple defeasible, also called qualified fee. Remember, that is a type of ownership where we're not limiting your time, but we are limiting your use. And if you don't follow rules, you could, as the name implies, defeat your own ownership, or in other words, you have to qualify for your ownership. So of defeasible, there are two separate types. Fee simple subject to a condition subsequent, which is that mouthful. Says do whatever you want so long as you don't do this one thing. Fee simple determinable says here's the one thing that we've determined you can do. Misty, it's yours so long as you only ever use it as a horse farm. That's fee simple determinable. Manoj, it's yours so long as you never serve alcohol. That's fee simple subject to a condition subsequent. Now the other thing to remember, in determinable, if you break the one thing, it automatically is said to revert back to the grantor. In fee simple subject to a condition subsequent, you would have to regain it by way of a court hearing. And they would basically be given the chance to correct the action in that regard. Now remember on the test, if you see fee simple by itself, read it as fee simple absolute. Okay, fee simple by itself reads as fee simple absolute on the test. Now understand that everything that I just told you, those are all estates of inheritance. Every single one of them can be willed to your heirs. But if it's one of those defeasible ones, what you had is what your heirs get as well. Okay, what you had is what your heirs get as well. So if Misty can only use it as a horse farm, she leaves it to her son. Her son will own it forever until he dies or whatever, but he can only ever use it as a horse farm. Now the other two that came into play is the different types of life estates. Okay, we got life estates. The life estates were conventional life estates, where the measuring life and the life tenant are the same person. Adriana, you own this so long as you are alive. That is a conventional life estate. That is the only one that is not an estate of inheritance ever. Why? Because the second Adriana dies and her will kicks in, it's not hers to own anymore. And then remember, those life estates are typically left to a remainder man, a named third party that it goes to upon someone's death, or there is no remainder man and they revert back to the grantor or the grantor's heirs. So the conventional life estate, the life tenant, and the measuring life are the same person. The other one was the life estate per ultra V. So the life estate per ultra V is the measuring life and the life tenant are different people. Jacob, you own this so long as Kingsley is alive. And so if Kingsley dies, Jacob is not yours to own anymore. But Jacob, if you die and Kingsley's still alive, it's still technically yours to own, which is why the life estate per ultra V is an estate of inheritance. Jacob could will it to somebody and that person would own it so long as the measuring life, in this case Kingsley, was still alive. Got a question in the chat. How to remember which one is lien theory and title theory. Lien theory is, I'm trying to think of if there's like a way that I could make it a cutesy-tootsie comparison. Unfortunately, they both deal with titles and they both deal with liens, so it's just more of memorization than anything. So title theory states, which North Carolina is, utilize the deed of trust. Three-party instrument, the borrower, which is the grantor, the trustee, who is basically an attorney who holds this naked legal title on behalf of the beneficiary, which is the bank. So you get your legal ownership and then you turn around and you sign it away in North Carolina and other title theory states. And they utilize a power of sale foreclosure. They already hold title. They can sell it right out from under you. It's not a judicial in any way. And then the lien theory, you just got to remember, is the ones that use mortgages. Two-party instrument, mortgagor, mortgagee. Remember, the mortgagee is never me. So you are the mortgagor as the borrower. So when you are dealing with those, what happens is you have pledged the home as collateral for the debt using this mortgage, but you retain legal title. Say it again.
Lien theory is mortgages.
Lien theory is mortgages.
Okay, lien theory is mortgages.
Lien theory is mortgages.
That's what I need.
And then they utilize a judicial foreclosure, and then ownership would be transferred by way of a sheriff's deed. In North Carolina, in other title theory states, we use a power of sale foreclosure, and ownership would be transferred by way, at this auction, by way of a trustee's deed. The person who's holding that title. Kingsley, I need a little more context on that one. A lease fee estate.
I saw a question where it says when a tenant gets a lease, that the landlord obtains a lease fee estate, something like that. So I was wondering, because I didn't see it mentioned anywhere.
Lease for the rights and use of occupancy being available. Yeah. So this is where I told you some states we use different terminology to say things that we've said. Remember when we talked about privity of estates? That's kind of the same thing, a lease fee estate. Basically, you have a fee simple estate that you own, but then if you turn around and you lease it to somebody else, it is called a leased fee estate. You own it, but you have turned around and leased it to somebody else. That's all that is. It's that privity of estates things where you have an interest in it as the owner, and they have an interest in it as the tenant. That's all it is. Yeah.
Can you please talk about the differences again, about easement by prescription and the adverse possession?
Yeah, remember, an easement, by definition, is the right to use the property of another. Very important, right to use, never own. And so if I have an easement, I probably get to cross over your property, walk through your property, get access to your property. But we all understand it's your property. That's the whole point of an easement. So we had the appurtenant easements, which are two pieces of property where the easements are granted to, and they would be appurtenant to whoever owned them. And then we had the easements and groves. Now, when we talked about these easements, we said there's different ways for them to be created. Express grant, by necessity, meaning you're landlocked, and so you go and you force it because you need access to the property. And one of the ways that you could grant an easement is by prescription. So an easement by prescription means you went to the courts and somebody tried to stop you, and you want the courts to side with you and say, no, I get to keep doing it. So an easement by prescription is typically you start with the owner, and then you would potentially have to take it to court if they don't agree. You are claiming that you met certain criteria, so you should get to keep doing it. The acronym is OCEAN. Some things will call it High Ocean, which is, I can never remember the H and I because it's kind of silly. It's whatever. But OCEAN is open, continuous, exclusive, adverse, and notorious. You are openly doing it. It's not a secret. You have continuously done it, like drive over their yard to get to your yard. You are the only one doing it, exclusive. It is adverse to the ownership, meaning you know you don't own it, but you're doing it anyway. And it is notorious. You do not have permission. So if you do that and you meet that criteria for 20 years, you could force an easement by prescription that says you get to keep using somebody else's property. Now, when we talk about adverse possession, the criteria, the acronym is everything's the exact same. The difference is adverse possession is a type of involuntary alienation where we are saying we should own it now, but it's still 20 years. It's still ocean, open, continuous, exclusive, adverse, and notorious, but you are now claiming that you should be the owner. So you would actually file a suit to quiet title saying they're not the owner, I'm the owner. Because now you've got this title defect that says they're the owner, but you claim you should be the owner under this old school rule, adverse possession. So the big difference, as Misty said, is use is easements. Trying to steal it and saying that you own it is adverse possession. One last note with adverse possession, if there's any kind of title defect or anything on the title that suggests that you may have some ownership interest in some way, shape, and form, the time is only 7 years. It's under what we call color of title is what we call that. Color of title, if there's any indication that you could have some ownership interest, you only have to prove it for 7 years versus the 20 that is standard. Not all states recognize adverse possession. North Carolina does, but you could see it on a national test or a state test because a lot of states have it.
Thank you.
For sure.
Seth, wasn't one of the requirements you had to pay the taxes on it also?
No, that is actually not always a requirement in all states. In the example I gave you, that's the one I used, where, you know, the neighbor died and you just started taking over the property and you started taking the taxes and you started treating it as your own and you're mowing the yard. That would be an example of a much easier way to prove it because you did. Unfortunately, you kind of have to do things illegally in order to actually get adverse possession granted. So that would be a good way to prove that you met that criteria by paying the taxes, but it's not required in all states that you did. Yeah.
She also could have been thinking about, I forgot what it's called, but where if somebody's behind on their property taxes.
No. Jacob, she just got a phone 6 months ago. She's not watching the same TikTok channels you're watching, okay? She does not know about that. People talk about that on TikTok. You young people love to talk about that. That is such an abstract law. We don't even need to talk about it in this class.
I have never seen TikTok.
Class, but
I know we brought it up in class, but it's not something that's actually testable in this class in any way, shape, and form. So.
Okay. But I do have a sweet young girl. She's 21 that I work with, and she is showing me all the things.
There you go. Hey, listen, you go hang out with her tomorrow and figure out how to look at an internet browser and be on Zoom at the same time.
I will ask her.
Okay. If you need me to like admit you into this Zoom room so you can play around with it tomorrow, you let me know. Kingsley says, oh, I'm sorry, Corey. Let me not skip anybody. If I skipped you, I'm so sorry. I didn't see. Oh, thank you, Corey. Hostile and intentional for the H and I, which is also kind of ridiculous to put that in there because notorious and hostile, those are the same thing. And intentional means open. High ocean is completely unnecessary. Ocean satisfies the criteria, which is why I teach it that way. Corey, meets and bounds, excellent question. Meets and bounds is a type of legal description. Legal descriptions are important because saying that I'm selling you 123 Main Street doesn't tell you much. There's too many 123 Main Streets. So we have to have a legal description where basically if we were to hand that legal description to a surveyor, they would be able to use that description and come out and find the property in question. Okay, that is a legal description. We talked about 4. Okay, meets and bounds is one of them. That is one of the methods used in the original 13 colonies, which North Carolina is. Remember, it utilizes calls, directions, monuments, point of beginning. It starts at the same point of beginning, always ends at that same point. Meets is distance, bounds is directions. And then it also uses minutes, degrees. The monuments nowadays are stakes. They used to be things like the rock, the river, the intersection, the tree. And so you're going to just need to know that it is a legal description that is used in the original 13 colonies, and it utilizes all these terms. It's just words. Thence run 565 feet, northwest, 168 degrees, so be able to recognize monuments, point of beginning, minutes, degrees, calls. All of these things are part of a meets and bounds legal description. The other legal descriptions we talked about, the government survey system, you love that one, uses sections and townships based off of principal meridians and baselines. Folks, how big is a township?
It's 36 sections.
Square miles.
40?
6 square miles. There you go. A township is 6 square miles. And so within that township is 36 1 mile by 1 mile sections. Starts at the top right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to the left, drops down, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 to the right, drops down, 13. It runs like you plow a field, and it ends with 36 on the bottom right. How big is one section from an acre's point of view?
640.
640 acres. There you go. And remember, the legal description for those is smallest to largest. The northwest 1/4 of the southwest 1/4 of the east 1/2 of the northwest 1/4 of section 16, township 3 north, range 4 east. That's how the legal description reads. So there was government survey system, meets and bounds legal description, reference to a recorded plat, also called the lot and block method, used in very urban subdivisions. We drew a pretty map, we recorded the map, go look at the map, that's what it's saying. And then of course sometimes reference to a recorded deed, which typically contains another legal description like the meets and bounds legal description. There you go. Just taking the L on that. Yeah, that's what I say. That's my terminology. Some of them, folks, you just got to take the L on. I've been teaching this so long. There are certain things that I'm like, this is not worth it. Focus on the other stuff, you know? So Kingsley, property purchase for $200,000. Improvements accounts for 75% of value, 39-year depreciation term. What is the annual depreciation? Okay, so what this is saying is that a total property is $200,000. Because with the information you're given, this is all we can do. The improvements account for 75%. That means the building itself is worth 75% of that purchase price. So times 0.75. So there's your building value.
150,000.
Stephanie, you're messing me up here. Come on. So 150,000 is your building value. And then 39-year depreciation term. Here's the problem. Is this an actual question that was pulled somewhere?
Yes.
Yes. From the book.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's okay. Yeah. So I'm sorry. I'm like reading it, and it's just not using the words that I'm used to. So when it says 39-year depreciation term, that means that its economic life is 39 years. And so what it's asking for is how much would you depreciate each year over the straight line method? Take your 150,000 divided by your economic life of 39. You would depreciate it by 3,846 each year.
I got the right answer, but I didn't know how.
That's why I was confused. How can the improvements alone be the value of the property?
So remember, this is using the cost approach to real property valuation. And so the land we never depreciate. So what we're saying is, if we were to purchase this, and let's say the building, of course the building's not brand new, but what it's saying is if the building was brand new, it accounts for this much value. And so it's saying if it is brand new, how much would you depreciate it each year if its economic life is 39 years? That's a straight line approach method. So you just take the value of the building divided by the economic life, which gives you the amount that you would depreciate it each year for the straight line method. And that's where I told you the cost approach is a pain in the butt.
So the improvement in here is the cost of the building, and then 200,000 is the cost of the building plus the cost of the land. Is that what it is?
Yeah, 200,000. Because remember, when you buy property, you get the land and the house. So 200,000 is everything. But what it's saying, the improvements. Remember, improvements are sidewalks, houses, structures. You know, anything that you make an improvement to, that's all an appurtenance. But the building, what they basically, instead of using the word building, they just use the word improvement. So the building is worth 75% of that $200,000. Yeah. Hey, you saw it trip me up for a second, too. I had to look at it for a minute. Yeah. There you go. Well, what else? You know, sometimes I'm like a walking, talking encyclopedia on this stuff, and every once in a while you'll throw me a curveball, and I'm just like,
Well, can we go over area? That's probably like very simple.
Yeah, just area is basic math calculations. It's length times width. So if we're dealing with a rectangular property that is 60 feet by 30 feet, all you're doing is taking your, don't get so caught up in the words length times width either. It's one side times one side. So 60 times 30, and that gives you square footage. okay? But then when we're dealing with land, like if this was a house, that's enough. If we're dealing with land, it'd be a much bigger number, and we typically convert it to acreage. Well, remember, there are 43,560 square feet in 1 acre. And so even this tiny little piece of property, if we wanted to convert it to acreage, divided by 43,560, this is itty bitty, it's 0.04 acres. Tiny, tiny. So the only other thing, just remember, don't get so caught up on words. If we're dealing with something that's like road frontage and it says depth, that's how far back it goes. So these would be your front feet or your road footage. So if it said, you know, a property that is 100 feet with a depth of, you know, 700 feet, that's your depth. So you know your road frontage is 100,000. If it says it's sold for, you know, $120,000, what was the price per front foot? All they want is this number divided by this number. The only other thing that I'll warn you about when you're doing triangles, the calculation for area of a triangle is 1/2 base times height. In other words, this side times this side divided by 2.
How about, can you give an example about a quitclaim deed?
Yes. Let me, yeah, I'll do the quitclaim deed and then I'll come back to these, Kingsley. Quitclaim deed, folks, remember when we've got deeds, we've got different levels of warranty or guarantee that they're given. Now, when you are talking about like fee simple to feasible, you can never give ownership more than what you have. When we're talking about deeds and these warranties, you can give more than what you have. And so all these are different levels of promises or guarantees that'll fix it. So general warranty deed is the best for the grantee, highest liability for the grantor. Says, I warrant this forever. So far back as it goes, you're not going to have any issues. I warrant that I own it, you now own it. I warrant that you can convey it. If there's ever an issue, I will come fix it, and nobody can claim superior title. That is what a general warranty deed says. A lot of guarantees. Next step down is a special warranty deed, also sometimes called a limited warranty deed. And that is where I promise that I own it, you now own it, and you have the right to convey it, but I'm only promising that I have not encumbered it so long as I have owned it, okay? I promise there are no issues for the time frame that I owned it and that it's yours and you can convey it. That's all I'm promising. So it's a limited warranty, right? Next step down from that, bargain and sale deed. I own it, but that's all I'm telling you. Deal with it, right? Bargain and sale deed suggests I own it, but I'm not promising or guaranteeing anything else aside from that. And then we get to what you just said, a quitclaim deed. Quitclaim deed is most commonly associated with curing title defects. What you're basically saying is, I don't know if I own it or not, but if I do, I am quitting my claim to it. It's yours. So divorces commonly do this to clear title defects that spouses may have or ex-spouses may have. So I don't even know if I have ownership or not, but if I do have any, I'm quitting that claim to you. That makes sense? Kingsley, the name North Carolina Predatory Lending Act doesn't necessarily like spark a whole lot in my head. If I had to guess, it's going to prohibit usury. Predatory lending, you know, usury are the limits set by laws on how much they can charge you for interest rates. So I'm pretty positive that that would protect you from getting charged interest rates higher than limits set by law. Remember, usury laws, that's what that deals with. Does that make sense? Oh, you're muted, Kingsley, sorry.
Yeah, they gave 4 options, and I posted it on there. So the answer is D. I was thinking is A, but for some reason they said it's financing of upfront and single premium mortgage interest.
Yeah, so it does deal with usury. So it's basically just making sure that they don't charge you greater than interest amount set by law.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. What is this other one? Let me click this. See if it pops up on my screen here. Oh, I'm sorry. Were those the answers that you popped? I didn't even see that. That would have been helpful if I realized that you had already put those in the chat. Yeah. I'm answering without even saying it. Yeah. Debt service. Yeah, debt service, as Kingsley said, is just a fancy word for repaying your loan. You got to pay back the money you borrowed plus interest. So the P and I of your pity payment is referred to as debt service. So that is what goes into your amortization schedule.
And what falls under debt service?
Principal and interest payment.
Principal and interest.
Okay.
So you borrow $200,000, promise to pay it back at 5% interest. You got to pay them back $200,000 plus the simple interest of 5% on it over the life of the loan. So that debt service is just the principal and interest, the amount that goes towards paying down your loan. It does not include the amount that goes into escrows for taxes and insurance.
Okay. And then also I thought of this question earlier, and I think that the answer is yes, but dual agency is something that can also still be done in commercial real estate as well, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Remember, dual agency by definition is when a firm represents the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. Folks, let me give you a big warning on your test. You can never have dual agency with two different firms. It is impossible. So if we give you an option that says, you know, broker of ABC Realty is representing the seller, the broker of, you know, PPQ Realty is representing the buyer, and it's asking about dual agency, it's not. It can't be. It never will be. If there's two firms, that's not dual agency. Yes, dual agency is in-house transactions only. And please be aware that even some in-house transactions are not automatically dual agency, because if I said that there is a listing agent with ABC Realty and then there is another licensee with ABC Realty assisting a buyer as a customer, so they're working as a seller sub-agent, that's just exclusive representation for the seller. So be very careful of that word customer. We do not ever represent customers. So there may be two licensees both working with ABC, but if they're not, there's no loyalties to the buyer, it's not dual agency. That would be exclusive representation for the seller only. Restrictive covenants. Restrictive covenants called a private land use control, synonymous with deed restrictions. It is where a private property owner has imposed restrictions on the future use of the property. And they are an appurtenance and they run with the land forever and ever. If somebody is not adhering to restrictive covenants, it is not criminal. There are no public powers there. You would have to handle it by way of a civil injunction. You take them to court. And you could force them to stop doing what they were doing in violation of. Not to be confused with public land use controls, which is the government and use of police power for the betterment and enjoyment of the municipality.
Okay. I forgot what that was completely, to be honest. But when you say it, I remember instantly.
Yeah. Caveat emptor, doctrine of caveat emptor is a very alive and well old school doctrine in North Carolina. It says, let the buyer beware. It means the seller does not have to disclose anything to the buyer. Do not get caught up on the test. Folks, if a seller doesn't disclose their issues to the buyer, the seller is not in trouble. If the broker knows of issues and doesn't disclose them as the listing agent to the buyer or the buyer's agent, the broker is absolutely in trouble. The only penalties come from the seller from fraud or trying to cover things up, and of course, failure to deliver the RPODs or the MOG when they were required. But the doctrine of caveat emptor says the seller does not have to disclose anything. Nothing. I plead the fifth. But we always have an obligation to discover and disclose all material facts regardless of representation. Josh, you have a question? Oh, okay. There you go. Kind of jogs your memory back when I start talking about it again, right? What else, folks?
About the zoning, legal non-conforming and the illegal non-conforming.
Yeah. Zoning and zoning ordinances are within public land use controls. Zoning is a category of what we would like to see. Ordinances are the rules within. So if a zoning stated that everything had to be residential in a given area, they would outline rules of what type of residential under these ordinances that the government will allow you to put in this property. Now, if your property matches the zoning and ordinances, you are called a conforming use. You conform to the zoning. If your property does not match the current zoning, you are called a non-conforming use. Now, your non-conforming use could be an illegal non-conforming use, or it could be a legal non-conforming use. The key factor is timing. If you build a residential house in an area zoned residential, that is a legal conforming use. If the government then turns around and says, we don't want this to be residential anymore, we're going to change this area to commercial, they're not going to force you to tear your house down, so they will grandfather you in as a legal non-conforming use. You get to continue to keep your house there so long as you meet certain criteria or requirements. Ultimately, they would probably want it to conform down the road, so let's say that if your house burns down, they may say you can't rebuild it. But as long as you follow the criteria, you could be a legal non-conforming use, presumably forever. An illegal non-conforming use is you buy a piece of residential property, says homes only, and you say, screw that, I'm putting a restaurant. That would be an illegal non-conforming use. And that is criminal violation because of the government police powers to instill or impose this zoning.
So they can close the restaurant.
Oh, yeah, they absolutely could.